San Diego, California, December 8, 1846. In the middle of the night, in the desert 30 miles east of the city, Kit Carson, legendary American mountain man, lies face down in the dirt, not moving a muscle and doing his best to slow his breathing. Mere yards away, a Mexican soldier on sentry duty sits atop his fine California horse, coolly smoking a cigaretto and enjoying a brief moment of relaxation and solitude in the middle of the Southern California desert. Carson knows that should this soldier discover his location, he and his two comrades will assuredly be taken prisoner and likely executed. Still, as Carson grits his teeth, the soldier remains blissfully unaware of any enemy presence, merely enjoying his cigarette, filling the air around himself with the fragrant smell of burning tobacco, and peacefully observing the night sky above him. The unnerving scene drags on for several minutes, with the silence of the desert night making the already tense air of the situation all but unbearable. Suddenly, Carson grows even more concerned. With one ear pressed tightly to the ground, he hears a faint, thundering rhythm. He wonders if these are the hoofbeats of more California soldiers coming to join their comrade. Then, Carson feels a hand nudging one of his boots. As Carson strains his eyes down and behind himself, he sees the cause of the noise. It is, in fact, the racing heartbeat of one of his companions, the 24-year-old naval lieutenant Edward Beale. Lieutenant Beale, his nerves pushed to the literal breaking point, whispers to Carson, "We're gone. Let's jump up and fight it out." "Been in worse places before," Carson assures him, then turns back to flatten himself against the desert floor. Finally, the Californio finishes his indulgent smoke and returns to his main camp, much to the relief of Carson and his comrades. Carson is part of a three-man group of volunteers, comprised of himself, Lieutenant Beale, and a Diegueño native guide named Chamacta. They are on a mission to reach the American-held port of San Diego in order to send reinforcements back to their stranded comrades roughly 30 miles east of San Diego. The day before, the Americans, a combined force of U.S. Army soldiers, Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers, had fought a vicious battle against the local Californio forces. The battle, known to history as the Battle of San Pascual, had been fought in the interest of the ongoing Mexican-American War, in which Mexico seeks to retain control of its lands, which comprise most of the present-day American Southwest and Pacific Northwest. When the damp weather had rendered many of their firearms inoperable, the Americans had suffered dearly at the end of the Californio's rudimentary, but deathly effective, steel-tipped lances. After the Americans were able to bring forth and fire their brass field cannons, the Californio forces had been finally forced to disperse, but not before killing 18 Americans and inflicting countless more deep, grievous wounds in the bodies of the surviving men. Under the command of General Stephen F. Kearny, himself gravely injured after suffering a lance wound to his lower back, the Americans had retreated to the top of a small rock-strewn hill. Here, they found themselves surrounded by roaming Californio forces, who covered virtually all of the territory between themselves and their nearest comrades in the port of San Diego, thus cutting off any hope of escape or relief. The U.S. Army soldiers amongst this group of men under General Kearny had not only survived the battle, they have completed the longest cross-country trek in U.S. military history up to that point, traversing half the length of the continent after marching out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and traveling through Santa Fe. They had then trekked across the barren deserts of the Southwest before finally meeting the Mexican army in battle here in the desert east of San Diego. Their counterparts in the U.S. Marines and Navy sailors, riding under the command of U.S. Marine Captain Archibald Gillespie, had ridden out to reinforce Kearny's men. Now, these men, many of whom are unable to walk, much less make the 30-mile trek through enemy territory, had to rely on their able-bodied comrades to volunteer to make this perilous journey in order to send back reinforcements and ultimately save their lives. Among these able-bodied men, none was a more obvious choice for this seemingly impossible task than Kit Carson. Among the few participants in the battle on the American side not to hold an official position in the military, Carson has nonetheless already cemented his legacy as an inveterate mountain man, guide, and experienced gunfighter. After deterring a cross-country mission with secret correspondence for President James K. Polk in order to assist Kearny as a civilian guide, Carson had proven an invaluable asset to both the general and his men. Along with Carson, the two other exceedingly brave men, Lieutenant Beale and Chimocta, had volunteered to venture forth into the expanses of the hilly, chaparral-covered desert in order to at least attempt to save their comrades. They had waited until nightfall before making their initial scramble down the sandy cliffs of the rocky hill, being cautious to avoid the California sentries that lined the hillsides all around them. By the time the party had reached the bottom of the hill, it had become clear that their metal canteens would be too noisy to carry with them. They had thus each taken one last, long drink and left their only water supplies tucked into the rocks of a small arroyo. Carson and Lieutenant Beale had also discovered that, unfortunately, their hard-soled boots would cause too much commotion while they traversed the rocky ground before them. While their native comrade Chimocta continued on relatively unencumbered and silent in his leather moccasins, the pair of Americans had been forced to remove their boots, tuck them into their belts, and proceed forward barefoot. Now, as the Mexican soldier rides back towards his camp, Carson and Beale are suddenly horrified to realize that, somewhere in their crawling on the desert floor, their boots have come loose from their belts. Considering their already precarious position, retracing their steps to look for the boots is out of the question, and thus both men will have to complete the 30-mile trek through the thorny desert barefoot. With no other option, the three men carry on, silently trudging their way through the sparse landscape, sticking as best they can to the cover of dry riverbeds and small ravines. Despite their lack of footwear, they travel as quickly as possible, knowing that the rising sun will bring with it a host of new problems. Meanwhile, back at the American camp atop the isolated hill, the men find themselves in increasingly dire straits. Food supplies have already begun to wane, as has their supply of potable water. Many of the injured men are starting to see signs of infection, as the deep and incongruous nature of the damage inflicted by the long steel lance tips makes them exceedingly difficult to close and keep clean. Since the day of the battle, Sergeant John S. Griffin has worked feverishly to tend to the Americans' wounds, but it seems to the doctor that a never-ending stream of the bloodied, injured men pour through the canvas-flap doors of his operating tent. General Kearny himself, suffering from the lance wounds that had torn into his lower back and hip, had passed out on the dirt floor of the tent after insisting that more seriously wounded men be tended to ahead of himself. Simply in order to move the injured men from the site of the battlefield to the hilltop, Kearny's men had constructed makeshift travois. These two long poles, which connect at a point, after which a bed is built between the poles and attached to a horse, had for centuries provided the tribes of the Great Plains with an effective, efficient means of transporting goods and people. However, on the rock-strewn, hilly grounds of the Southern California desert, they provided a nightmarishly jarring, bone-rattling ride for their unfortunate, incapacitated passengers. Now, the few able-bodied men left have taken to killing and cooking their mules, beginning with the weakest and least useful animals, stewing the meat into a thin, greasy soup that the men do their best to keep down, with some being unable to do so. General Stephen Kearny, suffering greatly from loss of blood, has relinquished command to Captain Henry Smith Turner. The general, who had once led his forces out of Kansas to much nationalistic fervor, pomp, and circumstance, now lies prostrate, pale, and helpless inside of his tent. When they had first arrived atop the hill, Turner had ordered some of his able-bodied men to engage and drive off the California Lancer forces that stopped their movements and harassed them incessantly. This his men had managed to do, with their carbines proving far more effective now that the conditions had warmed and their powder had dried. But now, as the Americans languish on the hilltop, Mexican Commander Don Andres Pico's men and other contingents of Mexican soldiers and California volunteers begin to flood into the surrounding areas, looking to cut off any escape for their enemy and to mount a final charge to decimate their forces once and for all. Now effectively trapped and with their ammunition and food supplies dwindling further and further, Captain Turner is faced with the prospect of either turning out their remaining starving mules and horses to graze, in which case they would almost certainly be stolen by the surrounding Mexican forces, or to slaughter the animals immediately, rendering he and his men truly devoid of any means of transportation, save for walking to San Diego. The American soldiers know that, with every Mexican soldier who arrives to surround their position, the likelihood of Carson, Beale, and Chimocta reaching San Diego has become less and less. Don Andreas Pico himself has, in fact, surmised that it will likely be Kit Carson, if anyone among the Americans, who will make a bid to escape to San Diego and secure reinforcements. Though the two men do not know each other personally, Pico is familiar with Carson's prior exploits throughout the whole of Alta California. He knows that Kit Carson is a dangerous man, and that in order to secure a victory for the Mexican forces, he will have to be neutralized. Carson is known amongst the Mexican forces as El Lobo, or the Wolf, and Don Andreas Pico has explicitly warned his forces to remain vigilant, or se escapada el Lobo. The Wolf will escape. Now, as the hours pass on the hilltop, it seems more and more probable to the stranded men that their comrades' bid to reach American lines in San Diego has failed, resulting in either their capture, killing, or both. But, miles away, past the edge of the western horizon, Kit Carson, Lieutenant Beale, and Chimocta press on through the night, accumulating untold damage to their feet as they plod their way through the unforgiving landscape. By dawn the next morning, they are clear of the initial rings of Mexican security forces that surround their stranded comrades. By that afternoon, they are within 12 miles of the city of San Diego. But now, they face the challenge of navigating undetected through the several rings of security forces that surround the city and its harbor. Seeing that seemingly every known path to the city's limits are blocked by the Mexican sentries, the three men huddle in a shaded arroyo and confer upon their next move. Carson advises that they split up, a chilling proposition to all those involved, but a prudent one, as Carson wagers that capturing 3 individuals will be a tougher job for the Mexican army than simply capturing one group. And so, all 3 determine their separate paths, with Chimocta and Lieutenant Beale taking the 2 shorter routes, and Carson volunteering for the longer, more dangerous route. With no time for ceremony or sentimentalities, the 3 men part ways, heading west to the California coast, with each knowing that they will either succeed in their endeavor or, likely, die, and that the lives of their comrades stranded on the hilltop depend on them. All through the afternoon, into the night, the 3 men skulk through enemy territory, each on an individual journey of turmoil, peril, and endurance that will test them to their absolute limits. It will be past midnight when Chimocta and Beale reach the American lines, arriving around the same time, with each man so fatigued that they have to be taken to the USS Congress, stationed in the San Diego harbor, where they will linger near death for several days. Carson staggers into camp around 3 a.m., his more circuitous route having delayed him even longer than his comrades. In a near-delirious state of exhaustion, Carson confirms the location of Kearny and Gillespie's forces on the hilltop with Commodore John F. Stockton. Stockton informs him that reinforcements have been dispatched, and Carson finally partakes in the first food, water, and sleep he has seen in nearly 36 hours. Meanwhile, the men stranded on the hilltop, still with no clue as to the whereabouts of their relief party, continue with their struggle to care for their wounded comrades, with their infected wounds presenting increasingly more frightening spectacles with seemingly every examination, as well as to sustain themselves amid their shortage of food and water. The last of the starving mules are finally killed, their ailing and withered bodies offered up as a last-ditch form of sustenance to their starving masters. Though it is an unfortunate necessity, one that provides much-needed nourishment to the men, the gruesome, heart-wrenching spectacle of this slaughter only serves to further weaken morale as well as to cement the notion that they are truly without escape in the middle of the barren Southern California desert. In order to quench their thirst, the men dig into the sand until reaching a layer that has retained some level of moisture from the recent rainfall. The soil is heaped into squares of cloth, then any available liquid, however muddy and disagreeable, is wrung out. For 2 long days and nights, this harrowing ordeal continues. Finally, though, General Kearny is able to regain enough strength to return to command. His field sergeant, Dr. Griffin, informs him that, likewise, most of the injured men have regained enough strength to sit horseback. With their supplies nearly gone, and any hope of rescue seeming to be fleeting, Kearny orders the men to ready themselves for a forced march to San Diego at first light. Come what may, they will not sit on this hilltop to fall prey to their adversaries. At dawn, they will make a run for their lives to the coast. However, that night, as the tired and battle-sore men sleep fitfully, an American sentry on guard is sent into a near panic by the sound of an approaching force of cavalry. He calls out into the darkness, "Halt! Who goes there?" The call goes unanswered, with the thundering hoofbeats only getting closer and closer to the sentry's position. With his weapon now shouldered, the sentry calls out again, "Who goes there?" This time, however, the reply nearly brings the weary man to tears of joy as Captain William H. Emery, commander of the 200-man relief forces dispatched from San Diego, calls out, "Hold fire! We're Americans." The American camp now resounds with the cheers of men who, only hours before, had seen their hopes of survival as all but lost. In the midst of their celebrations, a single shot rings out from a Mexican sniper hidden in the hills, striking harmlessly into the ground. It would be the last shot of the entire engagement, as the Americans would find all of the Mexican forces gone in the morning, having returned under nightfall to Los Angeles to fortify that city against the newly realized American threat. The combined American forces will make their march to San Diego without so much as seeing another opposing soldier. They arrive on December 12th on a chilly, rainy day, much to the relief of Carson, Stockton, and the rest of their countrymen. Many among the American soldiers are overcome with emotion upon seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, as the endless stretch of water before them represents the culmination of their unprecedentedly long and arduous transcontinental journey. Though the war is not over, it feels for many of the young sailors, soldiers, and Marines that the worst of the war, for them, has come and gone. The spot where they had made their desperate stand and survived on the flesh of their mules will stand as a landmark of San Diego history, known forevermore as Mule Hill. What has only begun, though, is the national renown and celebrity of Christopher Houston Carson. His leadership during, before, and after the battle, and his willingness to lay down his life in order to aid in the rescue effort, make him a favorite topic of letters written home from American soldiers, sailors, and Marines now stationed in San Diego. One soldier pens a particularly effusive letter home to his parents in Connecticut, proclaiming that, "Never has there been a man like Kit Carson. All that has been said about him, and more, is true. He is as fearless as the lion, as stealthy as the panther, as strong as the oxen. I believe that Carson would attack a fort filled with Mexicans, single-handed, and drive them off." Carson, for his part, barely even acknowledges his accomplishments in his memoirs, writing laconically that, "Finally got through, but had the misfortune of having lost our shoes. Had to travel over a country covered with prickly pear and rocks, barefoot. Got to San Diego the next night." In the years to come, Carson will become a national media star, the subject of dime novels and newspaper articles that will cause his name to be as well known in many eastern cities as the President. The young naval lieutenant Edward Beale is said to have convalesced for an entire year before returning to active duty with the Navy, but he too will go on to national acclaim and a legendary career spanning decades of service in the Old West. Already known as a hero of the Battle of San Pasqual, he would rise to even greater fame in 1848 as the man to bring the first samples of gold from the streams of Northern California to the cities of the East. This tangible proof of the newly won state's gilded bounty would be a key driving factor in the 1849 California Gold Rush, an event that would reshape the nation forever. He would go on to a career as a successful diplomat, serving as superintendent of the Office of Indian Affairs before retiring to life as a rancher. He would remain friends with Carson, who remarked upon seeing his friend aboard the USS Congress that he, quote, did not think that he could live, as well as maintain friendships with Buffalo Bill Cody, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant, among others. He would pass away in 1893 at his home in Chester, Pennsylvania. Chamacta, the Diegueño native guide, by some accounts took a similarly long time to recover, and, by some accounts, perished as a result of his treacherous journey. His tribe, known amongst themselves as the Kumeyae, already brought to the breaking point under the yoke of decades of California rule, would continue to struggle under the United States government for much of the 19th century. They would play pivotal roles in the San Diego Tax Rebellion of 1851, also known as Garra's Revolt, as well as the Yuma War and even the Mexican Revolution. Today, Chamacta's band, the San Pascual Band of Diego Mission Indians of California, is a federally recognized tribe, with many of their tribal members residing on the San Pascual Reservation. As for Kit Carson, he will take over a week of recovering in San Diego before regaining the ability to walk normally, his feet so battered by the desert floor that he can scarcely take but a few steps without excruciating pain for days. But recover he will. Carson will soon be on the trail again, heading west to reunite with his family in Taos, New Mexico. Already an American icon and an inveterate frontiersman, Carson will go on to continue his exploits for decades to come. His travels will take him from San Diego, back through the treacherous deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, then to St. Louis, before finally settling in Taos for a few years before continuing his adventures. Though the Mexican-American War in California will continue with a series of minor skirmishes, the worst of the action in California has largely passed. The Battle of San Pascual will go down as the bloodiest, most consequential battle of the Mexican-American War to be fought on California soil. The Mexican-American War itself will drag on until 1848, finally coming to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But, though the men of Kearny's army can now take their rest, the battles that are taking place further south into Mexico, and the battles that will continue to unfold for the coming year, will go down as some of the most vicious, bloodthirsty combat ever waged in the 19th century. But the stories of the many brutal battles of the unforgiving and highly controversial Mexican-American War, as well as the many tales from the life of Kit Carson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. In 1827, a bedraggled group of mountain men made their way in a long train of humans and pack animals through the Mojave Desert in what is today southeastern California. As temperatures soared and water supplies dwindled, the leader of the party, Jedediah Strong Smith, hoped to make contact with the tribe who had saved him when he passed through this same territory a year ago. The tribe, who gave the desert its name, were known as the Mojave. A year before, reaching the Mojave had been Smith's saving grace. Like all mountain men expeditions, he and his company had been in search of territory that was both abundant in beaver and unclaimed by any notable military power, be that native tribes or European or Mexican officials. The world of the mountain men was steeped in cultural, national, and ethnic ambiguity. Their goal was not to destroy or subvert any of the peoples they came across, but to accumulate as many furs as possible, namely beaver pelts, and to head back east to make use of their fortunes by buying land or otherwise improving their station in American society. Jedediah Smith had come west from New York as a young man, finding his way onto an expedition out of St. Louis. He learned quickly that in order to survive in the austere and often inhospitable American West, one had to adapt quickly. think clearly, and move decisively. Or they would soon die a hard death many miles from home. This was the world of gray, where the enemy of one's enemy was a friend until they too became an enemy. Such was the case for Jedediah Smith's beleaguered party. In the intervening year, trappers from another band based out of Taos, New Mexico, had abused and killed a number of Mojave before swiftly departing from their lands, headed west to California. The Mojave saw no difference, nor would they have any real way of telling, in the Taos party that had abused them and Smith's party, which finally found their village and dragged themselves in, begging for food, water, and fresh horses. At first, the Mojave were friendly enough, sharing and trading food and water, though refusing to part with any horses. Actually, considering the circumstances, they were pretty darn nice. Smith even ran into a Mojave man named Francisco who had worked for his expedition the year before. Francisco was friendly, but informed Smith of the Taos trappers killing his tribesmen during the last year and hanging their bodies from trees. Smith knew this was certainly not good, and beseeched Francisco to take gifts to his chief and inform him that Smith and his party had no intention of committing any such acts, and only hoped to resupply and move on westward. The Mojave, for their part, seemed willing enough to help. They helped the trappers resupply and gave them fresh mounts, even provided grass canoes so the trappers could more easily cross the Colorado River with their belongings. The mountain men were exceedingly grateful for the help and seemingly unaware of any danger. But when they were halfway across the river, the Mojave sprang their attack, attacking with a barrage of arrows, rocks, and spears. In what took only a matter of seconds, 10 men were hacked, pierced, and bludgeoned to death as their dying screams mixed with the war cries of the Mojave, the cracking of bones, and the placid rippling of the Colorado River. The attack took place with such ferocity and surprise, the 9 remaining members could only make their way as fast as possible to the other side, amidst a barrage of arrows and rocks and spears, to try and take cover. And as the Mojave hacked the 10 unfortunate trappers into pieces, and also carried off 2 native women traveling with the party, there was a momentary lull in their attack. As Smith took stock of their available weaponry, some knives, some hatchets, and 5 rifles with limited ammunition. And what must have been an agonizing few minutes of nerve-rattling silence, the men lashed knives to the longest, straightest branches they could find, double-checked the shot in their rifles, and unsheathed their hatchets in anticipation of the close, bloody conflict to come. Smith wrote in his diary that he had reassured his men that they would in fact survive the attack that was soon to come. But, he confided, he did not actually believe this was possible. However, he remained cool, and after allowing the oncoming Mojave to charge within rifle range, ordered a volley to be shot into their midst. 2 Mojaves were killed outright. It was never the custom of any native tribe to sacrifice large numbers of warriors to gain a victory or a position, and accordingly, the Mojave broke their attack and retreated to the safety of the village. This afforded the trappers a chance to slip out into the desert and head west from near today's Needles, California, to today's San Fernando Valley. Here, they were found and cared for by a local California rancher. Then, they set about their way north through the San Joaquin Valley, in hopes of meeting with a group that they had left there the year before. From here, near the present-day city of Modesto, they were to continue northward on a journey that would see them survive inclement weather, hostile European powers, and, on another perhaps even more terrifying occasion, an attack at the hands of the Umpqua tribe. Smith would go on to survive that trip, make it all the way back to the yearly rendezvous in Wyoming, and even tried to retire in St. Louis. But soon, the trail would call him again, and at the age of 33, Jedediah Smith would be murdered on the Cimarron River by a band of the notoriously ruthless Comanche. His story is perhaps the greatest unknown odyssey in American history, but that is a story that will have to wait for another time.
July 14th, 1828, southwestern Oregon. As the initial rays of sunlight struggled their way through the dense forest canopy and vaporous morning fog, finally reflecting on the rippling waters of the Umpqua River, a group of 4 men prepare to cast off in their dugout canoe. Their intention is to find a more passable route of travel rather than the circuitous, marshy path they had found themselves on in the last few days. 3 of the men are part of a 15 to 20 person band of fur trappers making their way north to Fort Vancouver in hopes of trading some of the fruits of their labors for some much-needed supplies, horses, and a respite from the omnipresent threats presented by the wilds of the Pacific Northwest. For them, the conditions presented by their current environs are at once shakingly unfamiliar and tranquilizingly routine. They had been making their way across the American West for the better part of 2 years, from St. Louis, across the Salt Lake Desert, the Mojave Desert, over the Sierra Nevadas, and up from Southern California to Northern California, and then on to Oregon. They had seen all manner of hardships along the way, from grisly attacks to hostile Mexican government officials to attacks from hostile native tribes. Less than a year earlier, some of these men had been among the few survivors to emerge from an attack by the Mojave tribe in the austere, Joshua tree-strewn desert that bears their name. They hailed from all manners of backgrounds and ethnicities, though most were American Protestants from states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, and New York. Though their diversity in culture and experience makes their collective categorization all but impossible, it is safe to say that none among them had seen wilderness like what they had encountered in the previous few weeks. They had made their way up from the San Joaquin Valley in central California, northwest through giant redwoods to the northern California coast. They had hung close to the coastline, staying as close to the water as possible during the low tide and moving back up toward the timber as the water level necessitated. As they made their way north, they found the terrain and the native tribes less and less hospitable. The 4th man in their crew, though, felt right at home as they paddled up the frigid river lined with Oregon white oaks. He was a member of the Umpqua tribe, an umbrella group of several smaller subgroups, all of which had resided here in the Umpqua Valley for generations. Specifically, he was a member of the Lower Umpqua Band. The etymology of the word Umpqua is thought to trace back to a word from their neighbors to the south, the Tolowa tribe. It is theorized to mean a place along the river, or thundering water, or dancing water, or bring across the river. They spoke the Siuslaw language, lived in cedar plank houses, and survived by both hunting and fishing in forests, streams, and ocean inlets in their home territory. They were also, like most tribes in North America at this point, increasingly impacted and influenced by the encroachment of Europeans and North Americans in their homelands. Like most tribes along the northern California and southern Oregon coastal ranges, the Umpqua were not averse to violent retaliation in response to trespassing in their territory. But they were not averse to making their lives easier either. However masterful the Umpqua, and for that matter any native tribe, may have been as woodsmen, life for them was still incredibly difficult. Not only was hunting made easier with firearms, but cleaning and dressing the animal were often easier with steel knives than with stone tools. Falling trees and splitting firewood was a far less laborious task when using a steel axe obtained from the whites. Though beads made from seashells and bones were indeed beautiful, the glass beads from the European and American traders could be garnered in a wider array of colors and a far greater quantity. Medicines, foodstuffs, blankets, fabrics, and gunsmithing services were all highly valued goods and services that most tribes could procure through few, if any, other sources than via trading with the whites. This led to an unavoidable mixing of cultures and a variety of cultural, economic, and military alliances. Though clashes were frequent throughout the West, as had been the case for the trapping party in the preceding weeks, the prevailing rule was that the enemy of one's enemy was one's friend. Many in the modern world often create a fundamental false binary of simply whites versus natives, when this does a fundamental disservice to both groups. The native tribes from Alaska to Argentina lived in harsh, conflict-ridden worlds in which life was a constant struggle for resources and safety. Just as in the modern world, pragmatism often won out over cultural purity in the interest of survival. Though this party of mountain men were clearly and presently trespassers in Umpqua territory, they could perhaps serve more utility as allies than enemies, or so the Umpqua had initially thought. And, for their part, nothing would have made the mountain men happier. Though many among them were certainly partial to the ardent nationalism of the early 19th century, almost all were cultural and economic pragmatists, first and foremost. Their goal was not to acquire territory, nor to entice the native tribes into a fight. Quite the contrary, their endeavors were essentially purely economic in nature, and thus many mountain men prided themselves on their ability to navigate the turbulent waters between such wildly different cultures. This was especially true for the leader of this party, the young but already legendary Jedediah Strong Smith. Though he was only 29 years old, he had already spent a decade of his life in the wilds of the American West. He had been born in 1799 in what is today Bainbridge, New York, to Jedediah Smith Sr. and Sally Strong, longtime New Englanders of staunch, puritanical stock. The family moved to Erie County, Pennsylvania when Smith was still a boy, and by age 13, his innate thirst for adventure led him to find a job as a clerk on a Lake Erie freighter. Here, he came across a number of frontiersmen and fur trappers, many under the employ of the Hudson Bay Company. Thoroughly regaled with tales of daring, adventure, and riches had from capitalizing on Europe's obsessive demand for New World furs, Smith set out for St. Louis at the age of 17, and by 1822, census information shows him living in the burgeoning, though doubtless still austere, frontier city. Here, his hopes of obtaining employment with a fur company expedition were realized when he, along with 99 other adventure-hungry young men, answered a newspaper ad in the Missouri Gazette. The ad was posted by General William H. Ashley, another eventually legendary figure in the history of the mountain men and fur trade in the American West. General Ashley called for 100 enterprising young men to head northwest to the Rockies in search of beaver pelts that were used to make the hats now so in vogue in London taverns and Paris cafes. In the spring of 1823, the company, known to history as Ashley's 100, left St. Louis, and Jedediah left his old life behind forever. He had risen quickly through the loose commandatory hierarchy of the fur trapping companies, comporting himself with courage and composition time and again under the duress of frustration, starvation, thirst, and combat. He had seen countless close friends die in violent ways, endured seemingly endless travel and privation, and seen his boyish good looks scarred forever after narrowly surviving an attack from a grizzly bear. Through it all, Smith had been noted for his moderation, his piety, his reliability, and his skill as a woodsman, marksman, and trapper. Now, though, as he found himself seated in a canoe next to his Umpqua guide and trapper compatriots, Jed Smith was tired. He had come thousands of miles, seen so much, and yet still had not managed to acquire the financial success he had hoped to nearly a decade ago. As the iridescently haunting rays of sunlight began to poke more and more holes in the forest canopy, one can imagine the deep sense of fatigue that must have set in as Smith surmised his current situation in its totality. He and his men were all travel-weary, within striking distance of starvation, and summarily weakened in both body and mind. The preceding days had been worryingly turbulent, and they must have weighed heavily on his mind. He and his men had encountered the Umpqua a few days earlier in a trade meeting that encapsulated the terse, uncertain, and all too human nature of Native and Euro-American interactions spanning from the 1400s to the 21st century. Having spotted some Umpqua sentries at a distance, Smith and his party made signs to parley and initiate trade in hopes of both restoring their supplies and building an amicable relationship. Unlike their Spanish predecessors and American successors, this party of trappers hoped not to conquer or colonize, but merely to peacefully pass through on their way to Fort Vancouver. Even the most ardent extoller of the virtues of manifest destiny among them would concede that now, with a party of not quite 24 objectively overworked and severely undernourished trappers, was not the time nor the place to attempt a conquest of any kind. The Umpqua, who at this point in history rarely saw any white men, were simultaneously wary, curious, and confused. And given even a cursory glance at the territorial geopolitics all along the western coast at the time, but specifically in California and Oregon, it is quite understandable why. Though California had long been ostensibly under the control of the Spanish, the English and the Russians had, at this point, spent decades making forays into the ocean inlets and mountainscapes of the Pacific Northwest in hopes of laying claim to its innumerable resources in both flora and fauna. Private interests such as the Hudson Bay Company had also spent small fortunes on incursions deep into the unknowns of the region in hopes of establishing networks of native tribes and collecting intelligence on any potential natural boundaries to be had. In the Treaty of 1818, the United States and Britain, awash in the geocentric hubris of the time, agreed to share exploratory custody of a territory that was not theirs to begin with. Regardless, in the intervening decades, the Umpqua and their neighbors had seen a marked increase in the frequency and size of the expeditionary parties making their incursions into the territory. They had been intermittently accepting of and hostile to such incursions, but in recent months had warmed to the idea of building amicable relations with white traders in hopes of fortifying their own wealth. Jedediah Smith and his party had hoped to capitalize on this, though their interactions with the Umpqua's neighbors to the south had been terse at best and violent at worst up until now. However, seeing the only prudent course of action as taking the most amicable route, Smith intended to make some good trades and build at least some usable amount of rapport with their reluctant, suspicious hosts. The two parties had convened at the mountain men's camp on the west side of the bend in the river. At first, the mood was suspicious. However, after some initial offers and counteroffers, both sides began to relax, and a sense of reserved joviality seemed to prevail. Then, one of the men informed Jedediah Smith that an axe and a skinning knife had gone missing from the party's supplies. It was apparent that, if one of the trappers had not taken the missing items, one of the Umpqua had. Though known for his magnanimity and charity in such situations, Smith had learned through the incessant native thievery that had plagued his party since the Dakotas that no amount of charity would render the goods returned. And so he saw fit to employ more forceful measures. The suspected Umpqua was detained by Smith and two others, tied up and interrogated as to the whereabouts of the axe and knife. For hours, the suspected Umpqua denied any and all knowledge of the missing items. Interestingly though, even during this time, trading continued amongst a number of smaller parties in which the hungry trappers bartered for shellfish and berries the Umpqua had brought to trade. Finally though, the axe was found amongst the detained Umpqua's effects, though the knife never was, and he was free. Though he was indeed guilty of the theft, this particular Umpqua was a chief amongst his people, and now felt much aggrieved at his treatment by these American interlopers. He retreated across the river and complained to his fellow chiefs, demanding some kind of retributory action be taken in defense of his honor. The most senior chief in the group dissuaded him from this pursuit, though, arguing that he had not been so egregiously assaulted as to merit the killing of the trappers. However, it would be only a short time later when that same chief, having re-engaged in trading with the trapping party, was himself offended. The two conflicting accounts of what happened next are as follows. In the Umpqua's recounting, the chief in question thought it would be greatly amusing to ride about the camp on one of the fine mounts in possession of the trappers. The trapper who owned the horse ordered him off at gunpoint, and a fight then and there was narrowly avoided. In the trapper's account, the chief was in no uncertain terms directed to dismount, but no kind of firearm was brandished. Despite the disparity in accounts, in either case, an immediate confrontation was avoided. The Umpqua met again across the river and decided that immediate retribution was still not the most prudent answer, and so the auspices of normality with the trappers should be maintained. Hence, the Umpqua who had agreed to guide Smith and his cohorts upriver agreed to stay at the campsite with them in order to leave the next morning. Before his companions left, though, plans were made for exacting the revenge the Umpquas felt to be rightfully theirs. Ostensible agreements were made to resume trading the next day, and the trappers fell into preparing their meals and readying themselves for a night's sleep. Jedediah Smith had his suspicions as to the Umpqua's intent, but could do little more than feign normality and carry on with the evening's tasks. With his small force against the several dozen Umpqua, here in the middle of nowhere, any attempt at an offensive attack would likely result in their small party being overrun. Though there is no record of it, Smith may have conferred with his more senior party members as to the most plausible courses of action. But no determined defensive plan was set in place, nor were the men notified of any suspected heightened threat. However, the next morning, as Smith and company warily paddled their canoe around a bend in the river and out of sight, many in the camp were still asleep. In the succeeding hour or so, many would wake up and begin their morning tasks of checking their equipment and procuring themselves some breakfast before setting about the more laborious tasks of their day. Smith, Leland, and Turner, along with their guide, carried out their intended mission of scouting out a more desirable route to travel. As they made their way back, they paddled with the vigor of men looking forward to a hearty breakfast after a hard morning's work. Then, just as they approached the bend in the river around which they had disappeared earlier that morning, they heard a riotous commotion coming from the camp, still hidden from view. As Smith, Leland, and Turner conferred with each other as to what the cause might be, the Umpqua guide snatched Smith's rifle and in one deft, intentional motion, tipped the canoe over, spilling them all into the river. The Umpqua swam to the western bank, while Smith, Leland, and Turner made it to the eastern bank, just in time to take cover from a volley of fire coming from a hidden group of Umpquas their former canoe mate had swum to for cover. They made their way to the top of a low promontory overlooking their campsite from across the river, and were greeted with a scene that must have haunted their nightmares for the remainder of their lives. All of the men in camp were now dead. Only minutes before their arrival, as their friends and comrades were still waking, a force of 200 Umpqua had overrun the camp. Some of the men had been cooking breakfast, some cleaning their weapons, and some were still asleep in their blankets when they were fell upon and cut down in a matter of minutes by Umpqua war clubs, hatchets, and arrows. Smith and company could only watch on as the aftermath unfolded, in which all of their belongings, including furs they had worked 2 years in acquiring, were either stolen or destroyed. Their livestock milled about nervously, made skittish by the sudden commotion and iron scent of blood. Eventually, they too were taken by the Umpqua. One man, Moses Black, had managed to dive into the river and escape his pursuers. According to his later account, he had been cleaning his rifle when 2 Umpqua appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and demanded he relinquish his weapon to them. Black had refused, and after a short tussle, he had turned and ran after being slashed across the back by the Umpqua's knives. he had managed to jump into the river and avoid the arrows and rocks that rained down around him, making it to the eastern bank of the river and escaping. On his flight to the river, he had seen Thomas Virgin being hacked to pieces by a pair of Umpqua warriors, and another trapper, whom he believed to be Thomas Dawes, being chased down by a group of Umpqua in a canoe. Smith, Leland, and Turner, however, had no knowledge of Black's escape, and thus both parties, Smith and company as well as Moses Black, believed themselves to be the sole survivors of the massacre. However, regardless of their communication breakdown, the only viable destination for any trapper lost in that hostile country was to make their way north, as the party had originally intended, to Fort Vancouver. A tortuous hike of roughly 200 miles up rocky shoreline and through unforgiving woodlands that would be incredibly taxing for even fit, well-fed individuals. It would not be until August 8th that Moses Black would struggle to the gates of Fort Vancouver. He was half dead and being nearly carried by a kindly Tillamook native who had taken it upon himself to guide the starving, desperate man to his destination. At first, Black could not bring himself to speak, so shaken were his nerves. The commander of the fort ordered the gates opened and for the clearly traumatized man to be brought in and cared for. After being wrapped in blankets and given a warm drink, Black was able to still his nerves long enough to articulate the horrors of his plight. A retributive excursion was immediately planned by the fort's commander, Captain John McLaughlin. Runners were sent out to the surrounding tribes, notifying them that a handsome reward would be paid to any natives who brought in survivors of the recently perpetrated massacre. The next day at around noon, Smith, Leland, and Turner staggered to the gates of the fort, themselves in little better condition than Moses Black. They too had procured Tillamook guides after making their way roughly 120 miles up the coast. Though both Black and Smith's party were all thrilled to learn that they were not, in fact, the sole survivors of the massacre, their cross-referencing of accounts also confirmed the sad truth that there were no other survivors. This, as in so much of the history of the Old West, is also a matter of some dispute in differing accounts. Umpqua accounts speak of two native women who were traveling with the party and were left unharmed, even eventually marrying into the tribe. Though they were not mentioned in any of Smith's journal entries, nor in the accounts of his contemporaries, that does not mean the Umpqua accounts were untrue. It would not have been uncommon for parties of trappers to provide either employment or safe travel to local tribespeople as their comparatively sizable and well-armed contingent made their way through the territory. However, we do know that every single trapper present, other than Smith, Leland, Turner, and Black, was killed there at the campsite on the Umpqua River. Their names were Thomas Dawes, John Gaither, Abraham LaPlante, Emmanuel Lazarus, Touchant Marichal, Martin McCoy, Joseph Palmer, Peter Ranney, Harrison Rogers, Charles Swift, Thomas Virgin, a former slave known as Ranza, and perhaps most tragically, Marion, the Indian boy whom they had taken into their party, by some accounts forcefully, in order to provide him with either protection, use him for labor, or both. All died tragically violent, terrifying deaths under a dark forest canopy, thousands of miles from most of their homes. Smith left only two written accounts of the attack, one to his brother and another to William Clark. Both are relatively terse in nature, and though sorrow is undoubtedly expressed on Smith's behalf, the veneer of his imperturbability remained uncracked. Undoubtedly, though, Smith and the other survivors were all psychologically traumatized and burning for revenge. Smith was informed by a sympathetic Captain McLaughlin that all would be done within his power to restore what property he could of Smith's, but that marshaling an all-out assault on the Umpquas was highly imprudent and thus out of the question. Crestfallen and physically depleted, Smith, Black, Leland, and Turner would eventually recover enough to make their way southeast to the yearly Mountain Man Rendezvous in present-day Wyoming. Smith would eventually make his way back to St. Louis, and after a short-lived retirement from the Mountain Man life, find himself on the Cimarron River in present-day Kansas. It would be here, in 1831, that Jedediah Smith, legendary mountain man, would meet his end at the hands of the dreaded Comanche. But that, like the plethora of other harrowing stories from Jed Smith's short but remarkable 32-year life, is another story for another time. Mason County, Texas, 1925. Even in the stifling August heat, the local rodeo grounds were packed with people. They had certainly come to see the rodeo, but more than anything, they had come to see the feature show that would kick off the festivities. In a small pen, a yearling calf stood grazing. A few dozen yards away, a local man stood conversing with a few men he knew from his hometown. His demeanor was jovial, as he traded jokes and fed off the anticipatory energy of the event to come. At first glance, he seemed no different than his rural Central Texas counterparts, except that he wore buckskin leggings and a fringed buckskin shirt. But he moved just slightly differently, spoke just slightly differently. He finally bade his comrades farewell and hopped on his horse from the right-hand side, a habit that was seen as very peculiar by the American riders around him. His horse had no saddle and no bridle, led only by a single looped rein tied to a simple halter looped around the horse's head. Now, on horseback, he seemed transformed, like another being. Suddenly, he seemed dangerous. He then pulled on a headdress, full of feathers, ribbons, and beads. Now the crowd became hushed, partly out of reverence and partly out of fear. For the mild-mannered, gray-haired local man was not just another resident. His story was known far and wide. He had lived a life few could only dream of, seen and done things most would hope to never endure. And now, here he was. No longer a peaceable old gentleman who loved babies and telling jokes. The playful, mischievous glint in his eyes had shifted starkly, seemingly instantaneously. His eyes now seemed small, cold, and coal-black. Where moments before had been a warm and welcoming smile, was now barely concealed a snarling of his upper lip. Suddenly, every move was sharp and crisp, every action laser-focused, and done seemingly subconsciously. He had told of how, as a younger man, he had killed many a wolf and drank its blood as a means of acquiring the wolf's traits and powers. Now, to many of those present who had heard this story, they began to wonder if it might actually be true. The way he rode, the way he presented and handled his short, stout bow, radiated an energy and presence that most in the crowd had only heard of in theory. Now, they were about to see it in practice. The calf, weighing about 300 pounds, was released into the arena and ran about seemingly as confused as were many of the first-time spectators. It could be safely assumed that even in this crowd from rural Central Texas in the 1920s, somebody there felt at least a little bad for this animal. But that somebody was not Herman Lehman. He gave a loud, piercing war whoop, rode his pony into the dusty arena at full clip, chased the animal down, and loosed an arrow into its heart from behind, all while controlling his horse with subtle cues from his feet and knees. As soon as the bovine fell, dead within seconds due to blood loss from the expertly placed shot, Herman Lehman had dismounted in one swift motion, drawn his knife and cut the calf's throat to bleed it out. Then, again seemingly in one deft motion, he split open the abdominal cavity, yanked out the liver, pulled out the gallbladder, squirted its bile onto the liver, and ate it raw in large, ravenous chomps. To some present, this was as close to the Old West as they would ever get. To Herman, this was ultimately a sad and sorry substitute for the life he had once known and loved, for Herman Lehman had not learned his martial skills practicing on cattle alone. He had scalped, pillaged, burned, and killed real human beings all throughout Texas and northern Mexico. He had fought the Texas Rangers,
terrorized Mexican ranchers, and brutalized opposing tribes. He had been a proud Comanche warrior, wild, free, and bellicose, riding free on the staked plains of Texas. He had been the adopted son of Chief Quanah Parker and a respected member of his tribe. He had been born not far from Mason, Texas in 1859 to Ernst and Augusta Lehman. His father had died when he was very young, and his mother had remarried to Philip Bookmeyer in 1863. He was the third of 8 children, though on May 16, 1870, it was just 11-year-old Herman and his 8-year-old brother Willie who had gone out to watch the sheep and shoo off crows from their stepfather's burgeoning cornfield. As days on the farm in central Texas went, the boys assumed this would be a relatively easy day in comparison to the summer harvest to come. They were only a few hundred yards from their family's cabin when a small party of Apache made their move. They thundered over a small ridgeline and fell upon the young boys like eagles swooping down to harvest a salmon from a placid lake. Herman fought as hard as he could, but the chief present, a man named Colonel Viste, knocked him over the head with a pistol and lashed him to a horse. Within a matter of seconds, Willie and Herman Lehman were gone. Their mother and stepfather were not only horrified, but completely caught off guard and unsure where to even begin their search. All they knew was that the party had taken off to the northwest. Soon, they would hit the endless expanses of the North Texas prairie, and then they would likely be gone forever. The Lehmans implored every available military and law enforcement official in Mason and then San Antonio to help, but they informed them that they could do little as resources were scarce and the territory to be covered was vast. It would be a group of the legendary Buffalo Soldiers, comprised largely of recently freed former slaves from the South, who would pursue and engage the raiding party in a brief but incredibly intense firefight that would see the sergeant in command, Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz, become the first black enlisted man to receive the Medal of Honor. In fleeing this skirmish, Willie would fall off the back of his captor's horse and find himself stranded alone on the Texas frontier. He would, however, by sheer grit and determination and some luck, find his way back home. When he was brought to his mother, the traumatized young boy was asked if he knew where his brother might have been taken. He replied simply, eerily, that "Herman has gone on, Mama. They took him on." Willie had no idea how right he really was. Herman was taken far out on the plains, physically abused and made to work non-stop as a slave to the tribe. On the non-stop day and night ride towards the plains, Herman became horribly sunburnt and suffered from being severely dehydrated and delirious from lack of food. On the third night, they came upon a fat calf while crossing the field. Colonel Viste killed it, cut it open just as Herman would so many years later at his demonstration, and forced Herman's head into the gaping paunch of the still steaming dead animal. He forced Herman to slurp up the curdled milk from the calf's stomach. Herman vomited this up. Colonel Viste forced him to eat what he had thrown up. Herman threw up again. Colonel Viste beat the boy until he was bruised and bloodied. Then he was given a small piece of raw liver. This he kept down. The party carried on. After a few months, Colonel Viste would lead another raiding party to Mason. In fact, they would head right back to the Lehman household, where Herman's mother and sisters were tending to the farm as Philip Bookmeyer and Willie were out irrigating the fields. They attempted to, again, steal all they could and terrorize the family. But this time, Augusta Bookmeyer would let loose 2 loads of buckshot into both Colonel Viste and another brave who were attempting to climb through the window. The raiding party fled, back over the miles of hills and prairies. When they arrived back to camp, an enraged Colonel Viste, still with a backside full of lead shot, beat Herman to within an inch of his life. He then informed the young boy that his entire family had been murdered. This was not true and meant only to add insult to injury, as both Colonel Viste's flesh and ego had been so violently assaulted by Herman's mother. Herman fell into a suicidal despair for days. unsure how to escape, and unsure how to even find the means to end his own life. Then, something in Herman Lehman's mind flipped. Today, it might be diagnosed as Stockholm Syndrome, a coin termed after a terrorist incident in 1970 Sweden in which the hostage taken eventually began to identify more with her captors than her rescuers. But in the 1870s, out on the burning plains, young Herman Lehman knew of no such diagnostic term. Nor would he have had any interest, for Herman had now made up his mind as to what he was going to do. There would be no more plans of fleeing home. He was home now. Herman made up his mind then and there to become an Apache warrior. He said if they wanted to kill white people, if they wanted to run roughshod over the Texans and Mexicans and steal horses and burn farmsteads, then he would do all of that as best he could. Perhaps this was a place to put his rage and grief. Perhaps it was a purely pragmatic survival measure. Or perhaps it was both. But no matter the motivation, Herman Lehman would go on to be an unholy terror to anyone and anything he perceived as an enemy for the better part of the next decade. His exploits appear nearly endless. He would go on to be adopted into the tribe, to subsequently kill a medicine man in retribution for the murder of his adopted father, Colonel Viste. He would flee to the feared and fearless Comanche, and would ultimately be one of the last members of that tribe to surrender to the U.S. government. The many tales of Herman Lehman and the lives of a plethora of other captured frontier children all merit countless episodes of their own. And to be sure, those episodes are coming soon. But for now, those are other stories for other times.
Haverhill, Massachusetts, March 15, 1697. Thomas Duston's frosty late winter morning is disrupted by what sounds like an approaching flock of seagulls coming towards the northwest corner of his settlement. Thomas is a father of 9, including just a days-old newborn daughter. A talented brick mason, Thomas is hard at work building a new home just half a mile away from his current home. The brick home still stands to this day. It would become quickly apparent that the sound rumbling towards him was not that of ravenous seabirds, but rather an entity with a far more insatiable appetite. As the clatter of spears and hatchets and the hoops and hollers of the native Abenaki raiding tribe came into Thomas's view from atop the hill, it became clear they could only be headed towards one place, the homestead now occupied by his wife and children. The natives did not see Thomas Duston as they galloped forth, and the Puritan patriarch knew he had little time to stage an improbable rescue of his family. Thomas mounted his steed and dashed through the trees parallel to the natives' path towards his home until he reached the clay road that ran along his property. He dismounted and dashed forward, hopping the fence line to make his approach to the rear of the home. Pillars of black smoke rose into the misty morning sky from Abenaki torches, until suddenly they stopped in place. Thomas could only hear the desperate cries of a distant settler as the raiding party descended upon them in the road leading to his home. A single musket shot rang out. Then the air fell silent for an extended moment before the Abenaki howls ramped up once more. As Thomas dug in his heels and tugged antagonistically on the mane of his horse, he could see the Abenaki raiders come into his field of vision once more. They were on foot now, a half-dozen or so out front, heads half-shaven, faces and chests coated in streaks of war paint, some in loincloths, others stark naked, carrying an array of deadly weapons, including hatchets, lances, heavy knives, and a couple of French muskets. Thomas Duston took an advantageous angle that would deliver him home before the bloodthirsty warriors, as their pace had slowed as they labored up the steep incline en route to the Duston homestead. The elder Duston cried out to his children, "Indians!" as they stood in frozen disbelief, staring down upon the screeching marauders now closing in upon them. The children hurried back towards the house. Thomas called out to his oldest children, Thomas Jr. and Elizabeth, to head for the neighboring marsh house, a garrison located a mile away up on Pecker's Hill.
Thomas burst into his home and shouted again, "Indians!" The warmth of the fireplace could be felt as the flames danced shadows onto the walls of the room. In her bed lay his wife, Hannah, the 39-year-old matriarch of the Duston clan. She had been bedridden since the birth of her 12th child, and the 9th that had yet survived just 1 week before. The infant's name is Martha. Hannah's nurse, Mary Neff, held the infant Martha in her hands. As she looked out the front window, her mouth agape at the image of the first warrior brandishing a French musket making his way to the clearing just a few dozen yards away. Mary was a widow in her 50s. She lived just a half-mile away from the Dutton estate and frequently came to aid Hannah and her children. Thomas gave a quick look towards the side door of the home, signaling to Hannah and Mary to flee with the infant child once Thomas walked out to face the attackers through the front of the home. As Thomas crossed the threshold and stood at the precipice of his front porch, he saw a dozen Abenaki warriors, now angling towards the house from all sides, sprinting forward with reckless abandon. Thomas began to line the sights of his musket upon the nearest native warrior, but instead he quickly drew down his firearm and mounted his horse, foregoing the opportunity to shoot. The horse was directed towards Pecos Hill, the path of which his 8 other children would be frantically attempting to travel. As he rode out from his home, a young raider that was nearest to him flung a lance that narrowly missed the Puritan's head. Just after this, he heard the haunting war cries of the Abenaki as they entered his home from behind him, and he fought to keep his mind focused on his young children, struggling somewhere up the hill before him. Once he crossed into the tree line, Thomas peered back upon his home. The raiding party had entered the home, and there he could not see Hannah or Mary anywhere inside the house. 4 of the Abenaki then rushed out of his front door and headed after Thomas. As Thomas Duston's horse caught up to the children, he saw in the rear of the broken column his 11-year-old daughter and 12-year-old son, as they stumbled and foundered, anxiously looking back over their shoulders, consumed with fear and worry. A ways ahead in front of them was his 19-year-old daughter Hannah. Thomas was faced with a heart-wrenching decision. The greatest chance for survival was to grab 1 or 2 of the children and ride ahead to the garrison house. It would all but ensure that some of his children would survive. Yet this question that knotted his stomach was an impossible one to answer. Which of his children would he choose to rescue from this murderous onslaught? The precious seconds ticked away, but in the mind of Thomas Duston, it felt as though time was standing still. Then, at once, the decision had been made. He called to his eldest son, Thomas Jr., and ordered him to gather all of the children and head directly to the garrison house atop Pecos Hill. Either he would save them all, or the Duston family would perish from the natural world together. While mounted upon his horse, Thomas Sr. scanned out upon the ground he had just covered for the approaching raiders. He clenched the paper end of a shot cartridge within his teeth, ready to reload as quickly as possible, and then, after cocking his musket, let out a holler and rode downhill into the fray. The first Abenaki appeared, running uphill towards Thomas Duston. The native raider dropped his musket as Duston rode directly towards him, and when the Abenaki attempted to leap from the path of the oncoming nag, Thomas kicked him in the head with a forceful blow. 2 more warriors raced forward up the hill, side by side, one with an axe and the other a sharp pike. Thomas drew back snugly on the reins of his horse, then dismounted, favoring his shot with his feet planted stably on the ground. His sights honed in on the larger of the 2, and wary of drawing his fire, the natives split apart, circling around him through the tree line. Thomas remounted and maneuvered his horse back up the hill, taking effort to place himself in between the advancing raiders and his children at all times. He kept the natives at bay as best he could, then rode uphill in search of his offspring. They were found just beneath the steepest pitch of the hill, the final stretch that led out into a clearing up to the garrison house. The youngest child, Jonathan, just a few years old, was falling behind. The other children tugged at his limbs in an effort to get him to keep up with the others, but the appearance of 3 Abenaki cresting the ridgeline just beneath them caused the elder children to let go of Jonathan in an effort to save themselves. As the raiders drew close to young Jonathan, Thomas Sr. rode out to him, dismounted from his horse, and aimed his musket upon the now hesitant Abenaki. Militiamen appeared atop the garrison, with musket barrels aiming down upon the natives. Suddenly, armed men burst through the front door of the hilltop fortification and stormed downhill toward the location of the standoff. On seeing this, the Abenaki scattered and retreated from the scene. The Duston children arrived at the garrison's doorstep, exhausted yet relieved, and were carried safely into the imposing structure by its inhabitants. Thomas Duston had saved all 8 of his children that had fled out from his home that late winter morning, but the fate of his wife and his newborn daughter was still unknown. Just a quarter of a mile away, as Thomas Duston had breathed an uneasy sigh of relief at their miraculous retreat to the garrison house, Hannah Duston and her newborn child were being herded away from Haverhill like cattle at a blistering pace. Along with Hannah, the infant Martha, and their nurse Mary Neff, a handful of neighboring Puritans had also been captured and were now being prodded forth at the tips of Abenaki lances. Hannah and Mary still wore their nightgowns, with double stockings and kerchiefs upon their heads, as was customary. Author Cotton Mather would recount the situation. About 19 or 20 captives now led these away, with about half a score of English captives. But ere they gone many steps, they dashed out the brains of the infant against a tree, and several of the other captives, as they began to tire in the sad journey, were sent unto their long home. Any instance of despair, rebuttal, or complaint by the captives had been met with swift and merciless death. Hannah and Mary had not the time to process the tragedies they had borne witness to, and shuffled ahead, with Hannah operating on merely an instinctual level, having experienced such trauma this harrowing morning that she had disassociated, her mind incapable of processing the abrupt murder of her newborn child or the likelihood that her husband and remaining children had been killed as well, or were in a similar position to the one she now found herself in. As they pressed on, the mutilated corpse of an English settler appeared before them, his skull caved in and his body disemboweled. He had encountered the raiding party alone that morning on their approach to the settlement. Hannah clutched at the arm of Mary, and they had both stopped their march for mere seconds to look upon the ghastly sight before one of their captors raised his axe, gave them a look of displeasure, and the Puritan women hurried forward past the grisly remains. Alongside the women now walked a boy, who looked to be around 14 years of age, roughly the same age as Hannah's son Nathaniel. At first glance, he appeared to be Abenaki. His dark hair fell down below his shoulders. He wore a deerskin mantle and a pair of unraveling slacks. But when Hannah locked eyes with the boy, she could see that he too was English. That boy was Samuel Leonardson, and he had been captured by the Abenaki in Worcester, Massachusetts, 2 years prior. They traversed the countryside in silence, passing through meadows, brooks, and ice-covered streams. The air grew even colder as the sun set on the horizon. A band of Abenaki who had been separated from the journey rejoined the party, and the natives began adorning themselves with animal furs about their legs and heads, preparing to travel through the night to an Abenaki village across the snow-covered terrain that now lay before them. There, the captives could be sold to the French as easily as beaver pelts, then placed into domestic slavery or traded back to the English for French prisoners. Just as it felt that Hannah's body could carry on no more, an Abenaki sachem called them to a halt amidst an ice-covered swamp to rest for the night, after what she had estimated to be roughly a dozen arduous miles into the wilderness of Haverhill. As a fire was lit, the image of young Martha being held by her ankles and swung forth into the trunk of a large tree like a bullwhip singed her mind. Hannah bowed her head and recited from the Gospel of Luke. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is now ready." The Abenaki sachem who had executed the infant child came over to where Hannah and the settlers had gathered in prayer. A necklace of bear claws jangled as he made his way to them. The orange hue of the fire brushed upon his face, and he stared forward through black, sunken eyes and said with a mocking tone in broken English, "What need you trouble yourself? If your God shall have you delivered, you shall be so." After the 4th day of being driven through the wilderness, Hannah's hope of rescue by a party of English militia sent after them had been all but erased. Of the 13 captured Puritans, including the infant Martha Dutton, only 8 still endured. And for them, it would take a miracle to be delivered back home. But the fate of Hannah Duston and the kidnapped New England settlers is, for tonight, another story for another time. March 19th, 1697. 50 miles north of Boston, Massachusetts, in a desolate stretch of land uninhabited by English settlers, 8 New England Puritan captives of the Abenaki tribe are marched north to a tribal rendezvous to be sold into slavery or killed. Among the captives are Hannah Duston and her nurse, Mary Neff. Hannah is overwrought with grief, having been captured along with Mary and Hannah's 6-day-old daughter, Martha. One of the Abenaki sachems had bludgeoned the infant's skull against a tree shortly after the women were abducted. Her husband had escaped from the raiding party, protecting their other 8 children as they retreated uphill to a garrison house out of the reach of the hostile natives. Hannah knew not the fate of the rest of the members of her family, and her mind couldn't help but imagine the worst had befallen them. She carried on through an internal drive toward survival that existed outside of her conscious thoughts, for as far as she could understand things, she was already dead. The 13 Puritans captured from Haverhill, Massachusetts 4 days prior were caught up in the throes of what can broadly be called King William's War. The war, otherwise referred to as the 9 Years' War, was the first of what would become the 6 colonial wars fought between England and France for the bountiful New World of North America. The territory of New France was led by Governor Frontenac, an ambitious Frenchman with designs on capturing the continent on behalf of Louis XIV by any means necessary. In 1690, he adopted a strategy of aggression towards the Puritan settlers of New England that utilized raiding parties comprised of French and indigenous tribes that were intended to drive a wedge between the English and their neighboring Iroquois people. However, the intended result was not accomplished. Instead, it had united the English colonies together against New France's aggression. As Massachusetts Governor Sir William Phips and an armada of New England ships arrived off the shores of l'Île d'Orléans with their demands that the French surrender the fort, Governor Frontenac dug in his heels and defiantly responded, "No, I have no reply to make to your general other than from the mouths of my cannons and muskets." Both sides refused to blink, and the hostilities raged on for the next 7 years, with villages pillaged and settlers plundered. Hannah Duston was to become just another nameless, faceless statistic in what were considered to be centuries of bloodshed over the ground she was now forced to march upon at the tip of an Abenaki spear. Subsisting on groundnuts, artichokes, and an indomitable will to survive, Hannah and the 7 other settlers who remained of the 13 captives arrived at the clearing the Abenaki chose to settle for the night. The natives set alight a large bonfire. The captives all huddled together away from them, and only Samuel Leonardson, the 14-year-old English settler who had been captured by the natives and lived amongst them for the past 2 years, went back and forth between the two parties, attempting as best he could to help the Puritan captives without drawing the ire of his new masters. That evening, as Mary Neff and Hannah Duston clasped their hands in prayer, a native sachem shouted down their method of prayer, telling them that the Jesuit way he had learned from the French was far superior. The sachem told them they had yet many days to travel ahead, and that they were going to a native village far beyond Pennacook. All the tribes of the Abenaki would be gathered at this rendezvous, and the captives would be stripped of their clothing, scourged, and then forced to run the gauntlet in the midst of 2 narrow columns of Abenaki as they tore at their flesh with sticks, pikes, clubs, and whips. They would be lashed, spit upon, and mocked. Those who managed to survive this would be rewarded in kind by being sold into slavery to the French. The party crossed beyond snow-covered hills, foggy gulches, frozen ponds, and icy streams. Hannah was struck with a fever she believed would have been the death of her had the Abenaki not stopped over for a day to hunt deer and rabbit, allowing her to recover enough to travel on. As the days wore on, captives were lost to the cold, malnourishment, and exhaustion, but Hannah and Mary struggled onward. The traveling party had met up with another band of natives, and the captives were divided up, with 6 Abenaki now leading Hannah, Mary, young Samuel, and 4 other Puritans an additional 20 miles north. Hannah was told by one of the Abenaki that he learned that her husband had fled over the hill to save himself, and that all her remaining children attempting to escape were killed, cooked, and eaten. She was told that once they had sold her or her scalp to the French, they would return to Haverhill and kill her cowardly husband. Hannah remained silent after this tirade, but in her mind, she considered that because in these lands she was not protected by or held to the standard of any rule of law of either God or man, she was entitled to strike out against her captors if ever the opportune moment were to come to pass. They'd arrived at the Merrimack River, to a large bend arching out for a quarter of a mile before the mighty stream cut back out of sight, where Hannah watched as the natives gracefully crossed upon the frozen caps atop the water, then waited on the banks across from her, commanding the English to cross. Samuel had experienced many precarious river crossings during his captivity and successfully guided the others safely along the far banks. Once there, they could see another party of natives all gathering near a small fire along the tree line beyond the meadow that lay before them. One of their captors spat upon the ground, pointed down to it, and instructed them to wait. As the men stood up from around their fire and walked over to meet their captors in the meadow, Hannah did not recognize any of them, only that their dress and markings appeared to differ from the natives she was now subjugated to. After a brief conference, a young warrior ran over to the captives, divided them up using his lance to instruct them, with Hannah, Mary, and Samuel separated out from the other 4 survivors who were instructed to join the other tribesmen. They were then joined by 3 of the Abenaki who had been with the Haverhill raiding party, and they were to head out at once to the north. Now, Hannah, Mary, and Samuel were under the confinement of just 2 Abenaki warriors, 2 young squaws, and a young native warrior. Hannah conferred to both of her fellow remaining captives that this could be the opportunity they needed to escape, and urged them to assist her in doing so should the fateful moment come to pass. Mary and Samuel agreed. They were led down to the banks of the Merrimack, where 2 canoes were stationed on shore, then divided up and loaded within them. They then set out upon the river. As its swift current pulled them quickly forward, Hannah had for the first time in weeks been able to travel by a force other than her own. She thought about the great distance that lay between herself and her home, but she knew that the mighty Merrimack flowed all the way back to Haverhill. They came upon a triangular island amidst the river, and the natives paddled fervently to overcome the rushing tide and arrive at the shoreline. They climbed out from the canoe, walking through the frigid ankle-deep waters, and made their way to an encampment. 2 hemlock trees bookended a meadow that had been cleared of snow. The natives cut down small trees upon the island and fashioned a shelter, half open to the elements, then a bonfire was lit in front of it to warm them inside. The natives did not invite their captives into the shelter, but allowed them to warm themselves near the fire outside. On the island were the 2 Abenaki warriors who had captured them, 3 Abenaki women, and with them 7 indigenous children, which Hannah could not fully decipher exactly from who they belonged. The natives dined on fish from the Merrimack, and the Abenaki men drank heartily from a bottle of rum. None of this was offered to the captives, and Samuel's attempts to forage the island produced only hunks of bark and root, placing them near the fire to boil free what sustenance they withheld. As the rum bottle was nearly drained, the Abenaki raiders danced and howled around the fire. Hannah attempted to retrieve the root from the fire, and one of the Abenaki squaws kicked a heap of ashes into her face. She fell back, then grabbed handfuls of snow, rubbing them into her burning eyes. The squaws then returned into the shelter and fell asleep, and as the last drops of rum were consumed, one of the warriors fell asleep near the fire. Hannah set aside the fire as the last native awake locked eyes with her, clutched at his axe, waved it to and fro in front of her face as the glimmer of the flames danced upon himself and the sharpened steel, then retreated into the shelter, curled up alongside the others, and began to snore. Hannah sat there for a long while, staring across the fire into the hut, considering the many possible outcomes of what she was about to do, then rose at once and took off the dead settler's coat she wore and stirred Mary and Samuel awake from an uneasy sleep. Hannah gave the signal, and they armed themselves, Mary and Samuel with hatchets, while Hannah brandished a poleaxe. They crept towards the makeshift shelter, their hearts racing. Hannah to the right, Mary taking the center, and Samuel to the left. The 2 warriors slept on either side, their heads pointed towards the fire, with the squaws and children slumbering between them. Hannah positioned her feet on either side of the man who had been her primary tormentor these last many weeks, and giving a nod to the others to ready themselves, swung the axe with all the force and might she could possibly muster, her toes and feet digging into the earth to stabilize her. And then a loud thwack could be heard as the blade of the axe plunged into the Abenaki's skull. 2 subsequent piercing cracks could then be heard as Mary and the boy followed suit and delivered their first blows. As blood poured from the ears of the man that laid beneath her feet, Hannah moved quickly to the next in line, the squaw, and swung her axe with everything she could once more, this time the blade of the instrument striking the target just behind the right temple, cutting at once through the ear and skull. Samuel had delivered a fatal blow to the other man, and Mary swung her hatchet into the face of the other squaw, who began to gasp for air with a horrified look upon her face as a stream of deep crimson blood poured from her mouth, muffling her cries. The commotion woke the children, who began to cry out loudly. 2 ran from the shelter, and the 3rd squaw woman attempted to escape from the uprising as she struggled to her feet. Mary Neff then struck her with the hatchet, shattering her arm above the elbow. One of the native children who had been kind to Hannah looked at her in horror. She motioned her hand for him to stay where he was, then slung the poleaxe over her shoulder and walked out past the fire where Mary had chased after the escaping native youth. Mary caught up to a fleeing female child and flung her into a briar patch that climbed its way up the bank, hacking away with the hatchet as the girl struggled in vain, entwined in the thistle. The wounded squaw, clutching her broken arm to her body, made a dash beyond where Mary and the girl were located. Samuel chased her down, tearing into her with the blade of his cleaver, but she managed to maneuver away from him and flee toward the other side of the island. Hannah pursued another of the children, this one a teenage boy. She pushed him down from behind and delivered 2 successive blows that penetrated through his skull, rendering him lifeless at once. Mary caught up with another of the survivors, a teenage girl, struggling to move through the snow, and delivered another series of lethal swings of her blade. Hannah spied the wounded squaw attempting to make a break for the canoes. She charged after her. Entranced with a fevered mix of adrenaline and bloodlust, the squaw attempted to avert the coming axe blow by jumping behind a tree, but the impact was still felt as the blade dug into her ribcage. Samuel then arrived and struck the good arm of the squaw with his hatchet. Hannah was determined to finish her off, concerned that she would arrive at a nearby native settlement and send a party of warriors after the escaping trio. When the squaw had been cornered by Duston, the Puritan delivered a staunch blow to her shoulder, but when she recoiled to deliver another, the gravely injured native turned and clambered away from her. Hannah delivered another axe blow into the small of her back, and she tumbled down the embankment into the frigid waters of the Merrimack. Hannah returned back towards the shelter, seeking to find the boy she had motioned to remain, in the hopes that she would return to Haverhill with him in tow. What she discovered was another boy, roughly 12 years of age, making his way towards the canoes. She sprinted towards him, the cold air whipping against her blood-streaked face. When the boy was just 10 yards away from the craft, she tackled him onto the rocky beach, then stood up, placing her foot against the base of his spine to hold him in place, and delivered one fatal blow to the back of his head. Hannah then collapsed onto the beach, exhaled deeply, and after a few moments, collected herself, crawled toward the shoreline, and washed the blood from her hands and face in the cold waters of the passing river. As the crushing weight of her captivity began to subside, her thoughts shifted towards her new plight. Making a successful escape from the vast sprawl of hostile territory she found herself entrenched within. The air had fallen silent. The flicker of the campfire lit the macabre silhouettes of the fallen natives across the island. Hannah took the moccasins off of one of the dead squaws, equipped herself with a musket, gathered up what supplies she could, then took her axe and splintered the hull of 2 of the canoes and sank them, then loaded the remaining canoe with what she had gathered up along with 3 paddles. The newly freed Puritans nestled together under a native blanket and slept. Hannah awoke, consumed with a driving urge to leave the island, and a contradictory one that tormented her with the fear of Abenaki scouts along the river who could spot the escaping settlers. The horrific scene of the island was finally left behind as they launched the canoe into the waters of the icy river. Hannah mimicked the paddling style she had seen the natives execute on the journey there to navigate the raging current. But just as they were about to make their way south down the river, Hannah reversed course and frantically paddled her way back to the island, using the angling current as it made its way around the mid-river mass of land to overcome the pressing tide. Shocked by the sudden action, Mary and Samuel were unsure why Hannah was determined to return to the wretched scene. Hannah instructed them to stay with the canoe, then headed up the bank. They saw her return several minutes later. She held a large knife she had taken from the Abenaki sachem in one hand and several scalps in the other. Then they made their way back down the Merrimack. Their canoe surged forward at a blistering pace. The current was so strong it had uprooted and carried whole trees downstream. Hannah scanned the riverbank for natives, but was often preoccupied with keeping their watercraft upright by paddling along with the roaring waters. The speed of the current would at least carry them home quickly, so long as they could avoid being capsized or spotted. After several days traveling across the bitterly cold and treacherous waters of the Merrimack, moving only during the night to avoid detection from the natives, they reached Haverhill at long last. Hannah was relieved to discover that her other children had all survived, along with her husband. A few days after her homecoming, Thomas Duston took Hannah along with Mary and Samuel to Boston to request the bounty be paid for the scalps they had procured. While the scalp bounty had been repealed the previous December, the Massachusetts General Court voted to pay them a reward, with Hannah receiving 25 pounds and Mary and Samuel splitting an additional 25 pounds. The legend of Hannah Duston is a polarizing one, but her story serves as an allegory for the battles, conflicts, and wars that would be waged between natives and settlers upon the American continent for centuries to come. But those tales of colonial and indigenous bloodshed are, for tonight, other stories for other times. January 18th, 1837. 18-year-old Abram Anglin rides towards the Trinity River with a group of close friends and fellow Texas Rangers. Though he is scarcely into his late teens, the young man finds himself deeply fatigued. Only months earlier, he had been amongst a small number of survivors of the devastating raid on Parker's Fort, in which the universally feared Comanche had brutally killed several settlers and carried off several of their children. The raid would make national headlines and go on to be remembered as one of the most seminal and most violent moments in Texas history. Several of the male inhabitants of the fort, Samuel Frost, Robert Frost, John Parker, Benjamin Parker, and Silas Parker, were killed. Anglin was amongst those who managed to escape and has since settled in Fort Houston, near the present-day town of Palestine, Texas. In the short time since the incident, Anglin has struggled with traumatizing memories and an accompanying lack of restful sleep. Though the scene Anglin and his cohorts witnessed and survived was certainly stultifying in its brutality and callousness, it was not unique on the Texas frontier. Though the tales of the raid on Parker's Fort would quickly become the stuff of national folklore, the raid, and raids like it that were now besieging the newly immigrated Texans, was nothing new. For decades now, the native peoples who had long held dominion over northern, central, and western Texas had been experiencing similar raids, with many, like the Apache, Waco, and Tonkawa, being driven from their lands by the incessant raiding of their long-hated enemies in the Comanche. Even the government of Mexico had grown so tired of the raiding upon their northerly settlements that they had agreed to allow Anglo settlers into the area, on the condition of their conversion to Catholicism, in order to act as a human buffer between Mexican settlements and the Comanche. Still, despite being all too aware of the danger involved, Abram Anglin has refused to recoil from further confrontation with the Comanche, enlisting with the relatively new ranger regiments which patrol the Texas frontier under the auspices of curtailing the incessant violence and thievery from both Comanche raiding parties and outlaw bandits. Now, he and his fellow rangers have been dispatched from Fort Sam Houston on an official mission. The young rangers, David Falconberry, Evan Falconberry, Benjamin W. Duthit, James Hunter, and Columbus Anderson, now make their way through dangerous, hostile territory to the banks of the Trinity River, searching for the quarry that they have been dispatched to hunt down, a pack of local hogs who have wandered away from the fort and now have been missing for several days. The men are tasked with retrieving the errant animals, preferably alive, and returning them to the fort. Upon arriving, they scour the river bottom, and soon find a number of the wayward swine. James Hunter and Benjamin Duthit volunteer to return the animals to the fort, while their comrades continue the search. They assure the men that they leave behind that when they return the next day, they will be sure to bring one of the fort's canoes back with them, so that the party might cross to the western side of the Trinity River to continue their search. The rangers who remain, Anglin, the Falconberry brothers, and Columbus Anderson, continue their search on the eastern banks for a number of hours, before finally becoming so collectively bored that they decide to construct a makeshift raft in order to cross the Trinity. The men cross the river at a point which will later come to be the small settlement of Bonner's Ferry, and continue on their search, this time staying together in a group for the sake of safety and communication. They spend another few hours searching, this time finding no pigs. Now fatigued and chilled to the bone from the incessant Texas north wind, the men decide to make their way to an overhang they had spotted upon first coming to the shore, in order to rest and warm themselves as best they can. While making their way to the overhang, however, the men are met with a disconcerting discovery. Embedded in the muddy banks of the river are several sets of moccasin-clad footprints. However, being cold, tired, hungry, and relatively sure that these were in fact tracks of the friendly Cherokee who also frequented this crossing, the men decided to carry on to the shelter of the rocky embankment. Arriving thoroughly exhausted from their efforts in the biting cold, the men stretch themselves out on the ground and are soon fast asleep. Within minutes of the last ranger drifting off into slumber, however, every man among them is awakened by piercing war cries to a blood-curdling sight. Bearing down upon them, and now scarcely 15 feet away from the overhang, are roughly 30 Comanche warriors, incensed at their presence and intent on killing them all. Before the Rangers can fire upon them with their single-shot rifles, the Comanche let loose with a volley of their own, filling the air with bullets and arrows. David Falconberry is hit by a bullet in the initial volley and mortally wounded. Columbus Anderson is also hit twice, struck with 2 arrows in his neck. Still, with adrenaline coursing through his veins, David Falconberry cries out, "Come on, boys, it's time to go." Falconberry and Anderson, both bleeding profusely, dive into the Trinity River, leaving grisly red streaks in the water as they swim to the opposite shore. Abram Anglin has been wounded in the thigh, with a bullet having passed through his powder horn and causing shards of the implement to embed themselves in his thigh. Evan Falconberry has escaped serious injury in the first volley, but instead of diving into the river himself, has taken cover behind a cluster of trees near the embankment. Now, he finds himself cut off from the river by the attacking Comanche. Seeing that he can be of no further immediate use to his comrade, Abram Anglin now dives into the river himself, with arrows and bullets striking the water all around him as he swims. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, Anglin finds himself on the eastern bank, opposite the attacking Comanche. Here, he finds David Falconberry, collapsed and bleeding profusely. Falconberry tells the teenage Anglin to escape if he can, and to hurry back with relief. This relief will not come, however, as David Falconberry is soon dead. Anglin now sprints as fast as he can, running roughly 400 yards before meeting James Hunter, one of the rangers who had gone back to the fort earlier that day. Hunter pulls Anglin onto the back of his horse, and the pair make a mad dash to return to the fort as the Comanches cross the river in pursuit. Anglin only breathes a sigh of relief when they are finally ensconced within the relative safety of the fort. With his nervous system rattled to a near breaking point, the young ranger finally falls into a deep sleep inside the confines of one of the fort's rooms. Though his day is done, the grisly work of the rest of the rangers at Fort Houston carries on in the afternoon and evening. One ranger, Captain Haggard, now sends out a rescue party in hopes of finding any survivors. After the short ride from the fort to the Trinity River, the rescue party is greeted by an unsettlingly violent scene. Discovered first is the body of David Falconberry, who had urged Abram Anglin to leave him and go for help. Falconberry had apparently constructed a bed of grass and was found lying prone on it only feet away from a small pool of water near the river. Next, the party finds the body of Columbus Anderson. Also lying prone, the ranger had managed to cover an astonishing 2 miles upstream after swimming across the Trinity River, all while bleeding profusely and with 2 Comanche arrows embedded in his neck. The rescue party then crosses the river and spends a considerable amount of time searching for any sign of Evan Falconberry. Much to their dismay, however, Evan Falconberry is never found nor heard from again. Though the rangers go to the extent of sounding the stream in search of his body, finding nothing, a Comanche account of the incident soon circulates the area, possibly shedding light on the missing ranger's ultimate fate. The account from the Comanche holds that Evan Falconberry had fired upon them and then put up a brutal, dogged resistance, fighting the Comanche tooth and nail, killing 2 warriors and wounding a third as they hacked, stabbed, and shot at him from all directions. Finally, mortally wounded and deciding not to leave his body to be mutilated by the Comanche, Falconberry had sprinted to the river, dove in, swam to the middle, and, amidst a swirl of blood, sank to the bottom, never to be seen again. In the brutal reality of the Texas frontier, this attack was nothing unique in its ferocity and inhumanity. The late 1830s would prove to be only the beginning of a decades-long war between the Comanches and the Texas Rangers. Both sides would find themselves victims and perpetrators alike of countless heinous acts, begotten by a seemingly perpetual cycle of violence in the conflict for ownership of Texas. For his part, Abram England would go on to join another ranger company only weeks later in March of 1837, where he would serve for several more years. He would eventually marry and move to the town of Groesbeck, Texas, where he would pass away at the age of 58. At Fort Houston, reprimands were made by no less than the fort's namesake himself, President of Texas Sam Houston. Houston insisted that the attacks could have been wholly avoided had his instructions to construct a brick-and-mortar lodging on each side of the river and to establish an official ferry site at the crossing been followed. The official dispatch, reprimanding the official commander of the fort in one Major Jewell, reads as follows. The first orders for the erection of a blockhouse and a ferry boat on the Trinity River were issued 5 months since, and a part of this time more than 100 men might have been employed for that purpose. The care advised by the President has been utterly disregarded, and owing to that alone is to be attributed the present melancholy accounts. You will perceive the necessity of preserving the most sleepless vigilance, and keep out guards under all circumstances, and never allow your enemy the slightest opportunity to catch you off guard. In the coming years, Texas would experience waves of violence that seldom had been seen in even the most conflict-ridden areas of the eastern United States. The ruthless combat on display at the Trinity River on this winter day in 1837 is but one example of countless encounters that would take place in the years to come. But the stories of those battles, shootouts, and in some cases, outright massacres, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southwestern Texas, autumn, 1838. On the banks of the Pecos River, a hunting party of Delaware native tribesmen and a lone Texas Ranger relax in their camp, taking in the scenery and fine weather. The Texas Rangers as an organization and the Delaware have built up a close relationship over the preceding years, having the mutual interest of stemming the tide of violence being wrought over the whole of the Texas frontier by the fearsome and formidable lords of the southern plains, the Comanche. The Delaware warriors are members of a long-displaced Algonquin descendant people who had once inhabited the lands ranging from southern New York to the present-day state of Delaware. Though they refer to themselves as the Line-Lape or common people, they have come to be known as Delaware, as their first encounter with European settlers came on the banks of a bay named in honor of Lord de la Warr, governor of the English settlement at Jamestown in the year 1610. In the succeeding centuries, the Delaware have been driven southwest, first to the Ohio River Valley, with some moving to Missouri in the late 18th century. Members of this tribe eventually made their way south to Texas, where they had assimilated into many East Texas locales with the local Caddo tribe. They existed peaceably with Mexican officials and citizens, as well as their Texas successors. Their shared interest in combating the Comanche threat had garnered them several close friendships with the Rangers and among the surveyor parties who existed under the perpetual threat of a torturous, violent end at the hands of the Comanche. The Ranger here in camp today, accompanying this party of 18 Delaware warriors, is 21-year-old John Coffee Hayes, better known as Jack Hayes. Having moved to Texas only the year prior, Hayes has already cultivated a reputation as a steadfast gentleman and a hellacious combatant. Hayes hails from the woods of Tennessee, the product of a military family. His father had served under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812, and he had been named after Jackson's famous Brigadier General, John Coffee. When he arrived in Texas in 1837, he carried with him letters of recommendation from family who had close ties to then President of Texas, Sam Houston. Though his arrival saw him miss out on the preeminent events of the Texas Revolution, young Jack Hayes has spent the previous year inexorably ensconced in combating the true biggest threat on the Texas frontier, the Comanche. The Comanche, a Shoshone offshoot who wandered down to Texas from the northern Rockies, had acquired horses from the Spanish in the 1600s and quickly became masters of the new animal and its potential. Though they had started out as a perpetually beleaguered people, subject to the violence and oppression of rival tribes, the introduction of the horse saw the Comanche rapidly ascend to primacy on the vast expanses of the southern plains. Their unique brand of whirlwind violence was not wrought upon Europeans alone, as tribes like the Apache, the Lipan Apache, the Wacos, and the Tarankawas suffered losses just as prevalent and as gruesome as their Spanish, American, French, and Mexican counterparts. This shared suffering led to alliances on the Texas frontier that many contemporary observers would view as unlikely. Such is the case with the young ranger in camp today on the Pecos River. His counterparts and the Delaware warriors accompanying him are not only allies, but close and trusted friends. Though large parts of their time are spent patrolling the areas west of San Antonio and Austin in search of raiding parties of Comanche, they have made this trip to the Pecos River, far west of the only notable settlements, purely in the interest of recreation. Their hope is to procure some of the bountiful game of the area, from bison to white-tailed deer, bear, bobcats, jaguars, and antelope. Hayes and his comrades have so far spent this day lounging about camp, taking their rest from the long journey they had made from San Antonio. A journey they had made on foot, in hopes of keeping a lower profile and not traveling with a large horse herd that might prove more enticing to the Comanche than a small hunting party. The men congregate about the camp, checking their gear, trading jokes, or, in some cases, napping in the shade. The only ones among this party who seem eager to explore their new surroundings are two of the younger Delaware braves, who make their way downriver in hopes of taking stock of the local game and topography. Thus far, the day has been a welcome reprieve from the often unyielding stress of life on the Texas frontier, deep in the heart of what was known to the Spanish as Comancheria. Suddenly, though, this placid riverside campsite scene is shattered as the cries of one of the young Delaware warriors is suddenly heard above the sounds of quiet conversations and trickling water. The young man sprints into camp, covered in blood, breathlessly explaining how he and his Delaware comrade had been surprised by the Comanche. His friend is dead, he says, and he is lucky to have escaped with his life. He informs the men in the camp that the Comanche raiding party is now headed south, likely towards Chihuahua, Mexico. A vote is taken up amongst the Delaware, and it is unanimously decided that the hunt will be abandoned and that the Comanche will instead be pursued. Jack Hayes has little choice. He indeed sees the value in seeking retribution, but his only option should he choose not to travel south with the Delaware will be to make his way back to San Antonio on foot, alone. In the end, there is little choice to be made. Hayes joins the Delaware as they begin a dogged, sure-footed trot southwards through the sparse, rocky landscape in pursuit of the Comanche. The Delaware, with Hayes in tow, keep up a slow but incessant jog that sees Hayes tire after the first few hours. But the party carries on, without stopping for food or water, until well into the night. Though he possesses formidable endurance, Hayes is unused to this pace and duration of travel on foot. Soon, it is all he can do to match the footsteps of the Delaware warrior ahead of him as they plod southward. They stop only for minutes at a time, taking small bites of dried meat and resting briefly, before continuing on again. This withering pattern continues until noon the next day, when the party finally comes to rest at a freshwater spring. Here, they are able to finally drink their fill, and many of them lay down in the cool shade to sleep. Among these is Hayes, who drops off into a deep sleep, thoroughly exhausted from the already monumental trek. In what seems like a fleeting few seconds, however, Hayes is shaken awake. The sun has gone down, and the party is heading out, hitting the trail again at the same incessant trot. With little choice in the matter, Hayes dutifully falls into line, again forcing himself to match the rhythm of the footsteps of the warrior ahead of him. For yet another night and day, the men travel on with the same routine. After resting on the second day, they again break camp, heading out into the moonlit night. Soon, however, they begin to smell the smoke of the campfires. Before long, the Delaware come to a halt and confer amongst themselves as to the exact plan of attack to be carried out upon the Comanche camp. It is decided that they will sneak into position inside of rifle range and ambush the Comanche at first light. The Delaware, with Hayes following suit, begin to literally inch their way towards the Comanche camp, crawling forward on their bellies in barely perceptible intervals. After what seems to Hayes like yet another eternity, the Delaware warrior next to him touches his shoulder, a silent signal that they need crawl no further. The party now watches and waits until sunrise. With the first few rays of morning light, the Delaware warriors and their Texas Ranger ally are ready. A signal is given to unleash a simultaneous volley into the Comanche camp, and while this initial volley sees only a few of the Comanche fall, the remainder of the camp is thrown into instant and abject chaos. The Comanche are unsure of exactly who is attacking them and of where the attack is coming from. Before this can be discerned, a second volley falls upon them, with more Comanche now falling to the ground, dead and dying, as their comrades scramble to mount a counterattack. Not wanting to afford their hated enemy the opportunity to mount their horses and escape, the Delaware warriors and Jack Hayes now make a daring, on-foot charge into the center of the Comanche camp, wielding pistols, knives, and tomahawks, intent on slaughtering the Comanche in retribution for their fallen comrade. The fight that unfolds is brutal, with the Comanche being cut down, scalped, and mutilated wholesale. Though the Comanche do put up a formidable resistance, it is soon clear that their fight is lost. With this realization, many of the warriors now break camp and make a run for the Pecos River. Several are headed off before reaching the water, and several more are clubbed down in the rock-strewn shallows of the river. In his book, Texas Ranger, Jack Hayes in the Frontier Southwest, author James Kimmons Greer sums up the fight thusly. The crunch of the light axe into skulls, or thrust of the long knife into backs of the Comanche warriors, brought dying screams and gasps. Some of the swifter braves reached the stream safely. Many of them were shot in the water. Very few escaped. Their need for vengeance now satiated, the party cuts their hunting trip short, making their way back north, back to San Antonio. For the Delaware, the coming months and years would see them expelled from Texas, victims of newly elected Republic of Texas President Mirabeau Lamar's aggressive and indiscriminate policy of removing all native tribes from Texas lands. This would culminate in what would come to be known as the Cherokee Wars, in which numerous tribes would combat and ultimately fall to Lamar's radical policies. This would see them moved north into what was known as the Indian Territories, an area comprising the modern-day state of Oklahoma. They would again venture southward with the re-election of Sam Houston in 1841, as Houston had always made it a point to maintain his position as an ardent ally of the tribe. Many Delaware would serve in invaluable capacities as scouts for the Texas Rangers, as well as the U.S. Army, in conflicts ranging throughout Texas in the 19th century. Eventually, however, they would be permanently relegated to reservation lands in Oklahoma, where their official offices still reside today. For his part, Hayes would also go on to see far more action in fights against the Comanche, the Mexican Army, local bandits, even eventually going on to move west with the 1849 Gold Rush, becoming the first sheriff of San Francisco in 1850 and amassing a considerable land and cattle fortune in Northern California. Hayes would pass away in 1883, at the age of 66, in Piedmont, California. He is buried in the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. This story, despite its scope and brutality, is but one of the countless accounts of bravery, vengeance, and violence on the Texas frontier in the 1800s that are too numerous to cover here in one episode. The many tales of the Comanche, the Delaware, the Texas Rangers, and the legendary Jack Hayes are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Eagle Pass, Texas, April 25th, 1875. Private Pompey Factor wipes the sweat from his eyes, clearing his vision of the nearly apocalyptic sight before him. Sweeping down upon his position are dozens of incensed Comanche warriors, all intent not only on killing Pompey Factor and his 3 fellow soldiers, but hoping to accomplish this grisly task via the long drawn-out tortures they have become famous for across the frontier. Factor and his mates are well aware that the coming minutes will spell either their doom or their salvation, and that the former scenario is far more likely. Pompey Factor, Sergeant John Barnes, and trumpeter Isaac Payne, all members of a mixed-race Black and Seminole contingent of scouts attached to the famed Buffalo Soldiers, are locked in a desperate battle with an exponentially larger attacking force of Comanche warriors. Despite the cultural and ethnic milieu present on the battlefield, the U.S. Army has, 10 years after the completion of the Civil War, still not changed their requirement that the officers in command of these units be white. Thus, in command on this day is Lieutenant John Lapham Bullis. However, at this very moment, regardless of their personal backgrounds or the greater ramifications of racial prejudice in United States federal policy, all 4 men are concerned solely with the immediate threat of the Comanche warriors now bearing down upon them. They are all experienced soldiers. Lieutenant Bullis is a respected veteran of the Civil War, and not only have all of these men spent the preceding year fighting the vicious Red River campaign, but these 3 scouts, Pompey Factor, John Barnes, and Isaac Payne, have grown up in lives radically different even from their compatriots serving in what history has come to know as the Buffalo Soldiers. Following the abolition of slavery and the conclusion of the Civil War, the U.S. Army had formed 4 regiments of black soldiers, mostly being former slaves, and wasted no time proving and then repeatedly utilizing the skill and daring of these regiments in their campaigns against the Plains tribes that had reignited with America's post-war revival of enthusiasm for westward expansion and settlement. Though the origins of the term Buffalo Soldier are in fact highly contentious, the prevailing theory is that the hair of the soldiers was unlike anything the Plains tribes were familiar with. They likened the hair of the black cavalry and infantrymen as similar to that of the hair of their buffalo robes, and thus the name stuck. However, one countervailing theory, one likely just as meritorious as it can be corroborated with quartermaster's records, holds that the troopers were one of the few units outfitted with buffalo hide coats to combat the open plains winter chill. The Army supply of wool coats had waned in 1866, and the locally sourced and supplied buffalo coats presented a viable, affordable, and very effective solution to the Army's supply chain conundrums. Thus, oftentimes when a soldier from one of the newly formed regiments was seen for the very first time by a Plains warrior, he would be sporting one of the heavy, full-length buffalo coats. Regardless of the origins of their name, the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers, even 9 years after their inception, is one of notable gallantry and exceptional courage in combat. Many, if not most of these men in these regiments, see their service as an opportunity to prove their merit and worth in a country that, though it had granted them their freedom, is still deeply divided amongst itself and in many instances openly hostile towards them. They also see it as a chance at adventure, to see lands they have never seen before, and to combat a legendary enemy that most had only heard of. However, this is not the case for their cohorts and what are known as the Seminole Negro Scouts. Though they are indeed of shared racial background with their fellow Buffalo Soldiers, they are in fact part of a rich and storied heritage of escaped slaves who had assimilated into various tribes in the American Southeast. Most prominent among these were the mighty Seminole, themselves a tribe who owned and traded slaves, though they also often fought Southern slavers seeking to recapture their escaped slaves. They also combated the U.S. government's attempts to take over their own homelands and warred incessantly with their hated enemies, the Creek. In the wake of what would become known as the Trail of Tears, the Seminole, along with many other eastern tribes, were forcibly relocated to what is today the state of Oklahoma. This resulted not only in inhumane treatment from the United States government, but in a whole new danger in attacks from tribes native to the area, most notably the Kiowa and the Comanche. After years enduring the misery of their newly imposed locale, a sizable number of mixed-race Seminole, weary of racial tensions and poor treatment from virtually all sides in their new homes, migrated to northern Mexico at the invitation of the Mexican government. Though Mexico had abolished slavery in 1837 and could guarantee, at least in some measure, a reprieve from the antebellum tensions of America in the 1850s, their motives were also arguably less than wholly pristine. Much as they had with the Texans nearly 2 decades earlier, the Mexican government intended to use the settlers on the border as fodder of sorts for the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache raids that had long terrorized the Mexican settlements to the north. Regardless, though they were no doubt aware of these auspices at least to some degree, large numbers of Seminole and what were known as Seminole Negroes moved south into the mountainous, rough-hewn borderlands that comprise northern Mexico. Here, for nearly 2 decades, they survived and even thrived in an entirely new and notoriously unforgiving environment while under relatively constant attack from Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache raiders. Pompey Factor had been born in 1849, the son of an escaped slave and a mother who had belonged to the Biloxi tribe. His family, too, had grown tired of the constant turmoil of the antebellum South and elected to move to northern Mexico. Though most were staunch Baptists, many, Pompey Factor included, were Jesuit-educated and well-read. Following the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865 and the abolition of slavery, many mixed-race Seminole ventured back north of the Rio Grande, and many had enlisted as scouts for the U.S. Army in order to assist in tracking down their old foes in the Comanche and the Apache. Though they are required to furnish their own horses, an expense for which they are reimbursed, and they are subject to the orders of Army officers, the scouts, of which Pompey Factor, John Barnes, and Isaac Payne are members, are far more adherent to Seminole practices and traditions than they are even to the practices of their enslaved predecessors and American cultural peers. Though most wear the blue-jacketed uniform of their Buffalo Soldier cohorts, the mixed-race Seminole Scouts also sport the accoutrement of their native forefathers in the forms of leggings, moccasins, necklaces, and in some cases, even headdresses. They are held in awe even by the toughened and already legendary Buffalo Soldiers as unmatched trackers and fighters, capable of traveling unheard-of distances on half rations and doing so repeatedly, day after day, until ultimately tracking down their enemy and emerging victorious. During the previous year's Red River War, they had been used to great effect by General Ranald Slidell Mackenzie as he had pursued Quanah Parker and those amongst the Comanche in North Texas who refused to acquiesce to being confined to reservations in Oklahoma. They had all served with distinction, including Lieutenant Bullis, who had furthered his record of accord with several instances of personal bravery and selflessness that had solidified his deep affection for and bond with his men. His relationship with his men is described as more familial than militaristic. It was said that every time a scout had a new child, the lieutenant would visit their camp acting in the place of a presiding chief and examine the baby, exclaiming that the child would indeed go on to grow strong and brave. This familial bond is a requirement for men who work in such small teams, in such remote places, under such dangerous conditions. The typical job of the scouts sees them in conditions such as the ones they have found themselves in today on the Pecos River, on a far more frequent basis than any of their comrades in the conventional forces. Lieutenant Bullis, Sergeant Barnes, Private Pompey Factor, and Private Isaac Payne had all been in hot pursuit of this raiding party, with the intention of catching them during the time-consuming job of getting their stolen mounts across the southward flowing Pecos to the western bank and disappearing into the vast expanses of the surrounding landscape. The soldiers had all dismounted and snuck to within roughly 75 yards of where the Comanche were pushing their horses across the river. All experienced fighters and keen to take the offensive, they had begun firing upon the Comanche, keeping up a relatively steady onslaught for nearly 45 minutes. During this initial combat, the scouts managed to kill 3 Comanche and wound at least 1. At first, due to the rate of fire and sheer ferocity of the attack, the Comanche believed there to be a much larger force attacking them. The scouts are armed with .45 caliber Sharps carbines, as are the vast majority of troopers assigned to serve with the Buffalo Soldiers. These rifles represent a new wave of battlefield technology that has drastically changed the dynamics of combat in the West in the little over a decade since its implementation. Combatants of 10 or 20 years prior were limited to single-shot muskets and rifles whose cumbersome loading processes and maintenance requirements rendered them a liability against foes in mounted warriors capable of firing several arrows inside a minute's time. Though the advent of the Colt revolver had indeed been a massive jump forward for the American forces in combating the Plains tribes, it is only in relatively recent times when the average soldier and scout could count on being equipped with both long gun and sidearms that were capable of comparatively rapid rates of fire. However, as is the course throughout so much of history, this technology does not exist in a vacuum. For nearly as long as their adversaries, the warriors of the tribes on the open plains have been acquiring revolvers and repeating rifles of their own. In this case, here on the Pecos River, this party of Comanche are armed with several Winchester lever-action rifles. Once they are able to discern that the force attacking them is not a sizable contingent of infantrymen, but a small force of 4 scouts, they begin to lay down a withering field of fire with their own weapons. In one of these exchanges, roughly 30 minutes into the fight, Sergeant Barnes' rifle stock is shattered by a Comanche bullet. In short order, the Comanche mount an offensive charge. This charge is the one now bearing down upon Pompey Factor and the other scouts. The nearly instantaneous decision is made to retreat to their horses, mount up, and ride for their lives now that the tide of battle has turned so decidedly. This is commonplace in combat on the Texas frontier, as either side saw little merit in last stands that few, if any of their countrymen would ever even hear about. Now, Factor, Barnes, Payne, and Bullis all reached their mounts staked over a hill only a few yards away, but out of sight. Factor, Barnes, and Payne quickly mount up and, in a matter of mere seconds, are riding north towards the relative safety of their larger conventional forces' brethren. Lieutenant Bullis's horse, however, refuses to allow Bullis into the saddle. Somewhere in the chaos of the fight thus far, Bullis has also incurred a gunshot wound to his right lower leg. Though it is a flesh wound, it renders him significantly less mobile than his men. The horse, driven into a frenzy by the chaos of the battle, now spins in tight circles and nips at the cavalry officer, who can only make repeated and increasingly desperate attempts to ensconce himself in the saddle and retreat. With every revolution of the wild-eyed horse, and every passing second, Factor, Barnes, and Payne get further away from their beloved officer and Lieutenant Bullis, and the attacking Comanche draw nearer. Within moments, the men agree that they cannot and will not leave Lieutenant Bullis to die at the hands of the Comanche. All three men wheel their horses around and charge headlong towards an attacking force that outnumbers them roughly 8-1. The men reach Lieutenant Bullis only moments before they are surrounded by dozens of charging Comanche warriors, whipping around them as though they are a swarm of wasps. This chaotic scene only serves to further frighten Lieutenant Bullis' whirling and wide-eyed horse, who again and again rebuffs the officer's efforts to get one of his boots into the stirrups and hoists himself into the saddle. As Lieutenant Bullis continues his efforts in vain, Factor, Barnes, and Isaac empty their rifles into the oncoming warriors. Almost immediately after his first shot, Barnes's rifle is shot again, the stock completely shattered and the firing mechanism rendered warped and useless. The fight quickly devolves into a hand-to-hand struggle, with Factor, Barnes, and Payne clubbing and stabbing any warrior who rode within striking range as they do their best to dodge incoming arrows and form a loose three-man perimeter around the still struggling lieutenant. Now, the men are again penned down, as Barnes makes his way to the lieutenant's position while Factor and Payne fight off the remaining attackers before the Comanche retreat to regroup and charge them again. For the better part of 2 hours, the four men fight off charge after charge from the incensed and incessant Comanche warriors, who only become more and more intent on killing their adversaries as more of their comrades fall. Finally, sensing an abatement in the action that might be long enough to grant them an escape, the men make a mad dash north, with Lieutenant Bullis sharing a horse with Sergeant Barnes, leaving the errant crazed horse behind and heading towards Fort Clark, nearly 60 miles away. For the better part of a night and a day, the men make their way to the fort, alternating between carrying Lieutenant Bullis behind them as they continue to scan the countryside around them in search of more Comanche assailants. Finally, all four men miraculously arrive at Fort Clark. Lieutenant Bullis credits them repeatedly and publicly with, quote, "saving my hair." Almost immediately upon their arrival at Fort Clark, Lieutenant Bullis files the necessary paperwork recommending all three enlisted scouts for the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest award for bravery. On May 28, 1875, Private Pompey Factor, Private Isaac Payne, and Sergeant John Barnes are each awarded the Medal of Honor, making them 3 of 18 total men who served with the Buffalo Soldiers who would earn such a distinction. While there is no record as to the personal thoughts of the men upon being awarded their medals, the events of Pompey Factor's life that followed would go on to speak volumes in posterity. Scarcely 2 years after being awarded his country's highest award for bravery, Pompey Factor and several other former soldiers would decide that their service had still, unfortunately, not garnered them the livelihoods and respect that they had hoped for. In 1877, fellow Buffalo Soldier and Medal of Honor winner Adam Payne would be shot down by Sheriff Clarence Windu at a local party in Bracketville, Texas. Without warning, the sheriff had simply walked up behind Payne and shot him with a single blast from a shotgun that came from such a close range that Payne's clothes caught fire. After his close friend was laid in the Texas ground, Factor and a number of other disillusioned veterans made the move back to Mexico for the next few years. Factor would eventually, however, venture north again, and again volunteer his services in assisting the U.S. Army in 1880. Unfortunately, his military career would also be marred with institutional mistreatment, as when Factor applied for his pension as an elderly man in the 1920s, he was informed that the Army was unable to find his service record. Eventually, his Medal of Honor itself was accepted as sufficient record, and a small stipend was granted. However, Pompey Factor would spend the remainder of his life working as a farm laborer, living in a small shack in Brackettsville, Texas, and eventually passing away on March 28, 1928, at the age of 79. Though the record of his gallantry and commendations certainly placed Pompey Factor in rarefied air amongst military servicemen, his experience outside the Army and treatment at the hands of his own countrymen and government is, regrettably, hardly unique. However, while the stark and unfortunate realities which shaped their experiences are all too important not to forget, it is also just as important to recall the heroism and selflessness of men such as John Barnes, Isaac Payne, and Pompey Factor, who gave their all in fighting for their family, friends, and countrymen. So too, is it imperative to recall the unconquerable nature of the native warriors, still fighting for their way of life despite the increasingly obvious inevitability of their fate. However, the countless tales from all sides of great service, sacrifice, violence, and vengeance are, for tonight, other stories for other times. September 16th, 1868, eastern Colorado. As the late summer sun sinks into the horizon, a group of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors sit in a loose circle around a cooking fire, enjoying an evening meal. Among them is a 45-year-old Cheyenne warrior named Roman Nose. He is a decades-long veteran of countless battles against settlers and soldiers from the United States, as well as raids against rival tribes. In the illustrious career he has compiled, Roman Nose has accrued many honors and a reputation amongst his people, his allies, and his enemies as a formidable tactician and a vicious fighter. Since the devastating Sand Creek Massacre of November 29, 1864, in which dozens or possibly hundreds of his fellow Cheyenne, men, women, and children, were mowed down without mercy at the command of Colonel John Chivington, Roman Nose had extracted his proverbial pound of flesh from the encroaching white settlers with a myopic fury. He had been born into a band of the Northern Cheyenne around the year 1823, son of a prominent warrior named Lone Bear and a beautiful and highly regarded mother named Black Buffalo Woman. Though as a child he had gone by the name Moseskanetsanunahe, or Bat, he had acquired the name Wokini, or Hook Nose, from his notable physical features, a name which the Americans would interpret as Roman Nose. He had fought at the Battle of Julesburg in Wyoming in 1865, and wrought terror and trepidation upon travelers all along the segment of the Oregon Trail that stretched to the northern plains. He had visited Fort Larned in April of the previous year, during which Isaac Coates, U.S. General Winston Scott Hancock's surgeon, observed Roman Nose in an argument with the general, noting that, "Of all the chiefs, he is one of the fittest specimens, physically, of his race. He is quite 6 feet in height, finely formed with a large body and muscular limbs. His appearance was decidedly military, and on this occasion particularly so, since he wore the uniform of a general in the army. A 7-shooting Spencer carbine hung at the side of his saddle, 4 large Navy revolvers stuck in his belt, and a bow, already strung with arrows, were grasped in his left hand. Thus armed and mounted on a fine horse, he was a good representative of the god of war, and his manner showed plainly that he did not care if we talked or fought." Though he holds no formal position of leadership within the Cheyenne, Roman Nose has built his stature within the tribe and their allies through countless battles, raids, and buffalo hunts. All throughout his travels and fighting, Roman Nose had fought fearlessly, partly due to his own personal resolve and disposition, and partly due to his belief that his war bonnet possessed a protective magic over him that afforded him protection from the white man's weapons. He had received the war bonnet as a gift from the Lakota warrior White Bull, who assured him no harm would come to him while he wore the headdress, so long as he did not violate its medicine by consuming any food prepared with the white man's metal utensils. Known amongst his people as a deeply spiritual man, Roman Nose abided by these directives fastidiously. In addition to following the prescription of White Bull, Roman Nose would partake in days-long fasts from food and water, often arriving late to battles due to his extensive prayer routine. Still though, despite his trademark tardiness, Roman Nose has, and especially the last few months, been the terror of the United States government. marauding about his high plains homelands, wreaking havoc and killing soldiers and settlers wherever he can. The preceding summer months have been busy, hot, and bloody. But now, for a brief moment, as he sits here with his fellow warriors enjoying a warm piece of fry bread freshly made by a Sioux woman serving as cook for the camp, all seems well, at least momentarily. Then, with all the disruption of a rifle's retort, the cry comes out from returning scouts that a contingent of white soldiers has been spotted nearby, and that an attack must be made as soon as possible. As he has so many times before, Roman Nose halts his meal and makes ready for the attack that will take place the next day. Just as he is making his way back to his lodge, one of his warrior cohorts rushes up to him, eyes wide in panic. The warrior informs Roman Nose that the Sioux woman who served them their dinner, not knowing of Roman Nose's prohibition against eating food prepared with metal utensils, had used a metal spoon to serve up their dinner. This action, though unintentional, now has resounding consequences. Roman Nose now believes his medicine, the great protection offered by his war bonnet, has been compromised. The Cheyenne medicine man's ceremony for ostensibly restoring the power to the headdress will take days, a luxury the mighty warrior does not now have. As the night drags on, Roman Nose contemplates his next move, the millstone of fate weighing heavy on his mind. Only 12 miles away, on the dry fork of the Republican River, on the south bank of what is known as Delaware Creek, 27-year-old First Lieutenant Frederick Henry Beecher works alongside his men preparing their camp for the night. They are a unique contingent of both U.S. Army soldiers and civilian frontiersmen, a combined force of 50 in number, assembled for the express purpose of pursuing and combating the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who have been so unyielding in their attacks in the previous few weeks. Commanding them is Major General George Alexander Forsyth of the 9th Cavalry, who had begun his career in 1861 as a lieutenant in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Forsyth saw action in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864, served as aide-de-camp for Major General Philip Sheridan, and had been awarded a brevet promotion to colonel on October 19th of 1864 for his actions during the Third Battle of Winchester and the Battle of Cedar Creek. Earlier in this year, he had been charged with assembling this motley band, whose ages ranged from their late teens to their early 60s. Beecher serves as second in command for this group, himself a veteran of the Civil War, acting as first lieutenant of the 16th Maine Volunteers from 1862 to 1864. He had fought at the Battle of Brooks Station, the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Battle of Chancellorsville, as well as the Battle of Gettysburg. He had been severely wounded twice, at both Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862, as well as Gettysburg on July 1 of 1863. At the Battle of Gettysburg, he had also received a citation for valor after refusing to surrender the regimental colors to the attacking Confederate forces. He was born in New Orleans in June of 1841 and graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine before volunteering for the Union Army. His family is one of prominent American stock, with his uncle Henry Ward Beecher being perhaps the most prominent Methodist preacher in America at the time. His aunt, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is perhaps the most famous writer in America, having authored the seminal fictional work in abolitionism at the time, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had served as a major media flashpoint in the galvanization of the country on the issue of slavery. His family is known as some of the most prominent and influential abolitionists in the whole of the Northeast. But they are also Americans, with a strident fidelity to their newly resolved Union and possessing no small amount of fervor for the fulfillment of the notion of manifest destiny. The country, fresh out of conflict within itself, now seems, 3 years after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, unapologetically obsessed with their own reconstruction and expansion. Both reconstruction and expansion, though, have thus far come at great cost. In the South, unrest continues to run rampant, with the seeds of long-held resentments being sowed far and wide. In the West, the ongoing war between the United States government and the menagerie of tribes that range from Mexico to Canada has once again become red-hot after 4 years of a comparative lull in heavy fighting. Though conflict on the bleeding edge of the frontier had indeed raged throughout the entirety of the American Civil War, it was only after 1865 that the federal government could marshal the might of their full resources in the fight against the Plains tribes. The mere existence of this 50-man force, though, now unfurling their bedrolls and picketing their horses down for the night, is evidence of the U.S. Army's assessment of the situation on the high plains as a desperate one that calls for desperate measures if the attacks made by warriors who oftentimes have personal ties to those massacred by Shivington and company at Sand Creek are to ever be abated. On the morning of September 10th, this detachment had left Fort Wallace, located in present-day Kansas, following the trail of what they initially believed to be a force of 25 native warriors who had attacked a work detail roughly 13 miles from the fort. The trail, however, soon began to show signs of a far larger force of native Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors in the vicinity. This prospect, though, was an enticing one for many in the party, as the largest problem for many units fighting on the open plains was not as much in combating the native warriors in battle, but in actually finding them in the first place. The vast majority of the time, pursuing soldiers and citizens alike saw their attackers, or their quarry, depending on the situation, disappear with specter-like ease into the seemingly endless flat grasslands. Now, as men begin to doze off and others take their turns standing watch, the night drags on, under the splendor of the northern plains sky. Many amongst them have lost friends and loved ones to the attacks of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and now burn for revenge that they hope is finally all too close at hand. However, even the most fervent pursuer amongst them would likely be shocked, and perhaps slightly horrified, to know that a massive camp of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, hundreds or perhaps thousands strong, lies only a dozen miles away from their force of 50 men. But when the sun breaches the eastern horizon on the morning of the 17th, the rude awakening for this small force is at hand, both literally and figuratively. Silhouetted by the rising sun, lining the ridge tops around them, are hundreds of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, resplendent in their war paint and letting loose war cries that jar awake those who have not yet been alerted by the men on watch. As First Lieutenant Beecher wipes the sleep from his eyes and takes stock of the situation at hand, his mind seems nearly unable to reconcile the bizarre sight before him. Not only are hundreds of warriors on the hilltops above them, but also are the wives and children of the warriors, looking on and exhorting their husbands and fathers to glory. Overseeing them from a distance is Roman Nose. Though not a formal chief, his leadership on the battlefield has been a pivotal element in the native warriors' successes in the preceding years. Now, as he watches on, Roman Nose fights a growing sense of self-consciousness as some among his people trade curious glances and hushed whispers as their best warrior only watches the battle about to take place. The word has gone out amongst the assembled Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho that no warrior should make any rash moves. Their prey is cornered, and, to the eyes of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors present, they are helpless. But as young men are often wont to do, a group of 8 teenage warriors make a foolhardy attempt at stampeding the soldiers' horses. Some of the 50 Americans fire upon them with their Spencer-repeating carbines, a new technology that allows rapid reloading as opposed to the muzzle-loading rifles and muskets of only a few years prior. Though none of the young warriors are killed in their attempt, the first shots of the fight have now been fired, and now a torrent of violence is unleashed, as rapid charges are made upon the small camp, with war cries filling the air, mixing with the sounds of commands in English and the cheering of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho women and children in their respective languages. As the attacks persist, First Lieutenant Beecher coolly and calmly fires upon the charging warriors, while encouraging his men to take accurate shots and remain courageous despite their obvious numerical disadvantage. First in command, Major General Forsyth orders the men to retreat across the shallow waters of the river to a small, desolate island located midstream between the north and south banks. Forsyth and Beecher assist their 48 men in forming a barricade with the very horses they had led across the river, tying the animals off to bushes and taking cover behind them. Almost as soon as the men are able to take their positions behind their unfortunate means of cover, another series of attacks ensues, again swarming down upon them seemingly from all directions. One after another, the horses tied off to the bushes are felled by arrows and bullets from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. As the men continue to take fire, more and more among them, recognize the riotous crack of the rifles carried by the native warriors. The chilling realization falls upon the men, now ensconced upon this barren strip of earth in the middle of a sparse high-plain stream, that they are being fired upon with Henry and Spencer repeating rifles. Some of these weapons have been procured by the warriors from both prior victories, such as the utter massacre wrought upon the cavalry in the Fetterman Massacre of a year and a half prior. Some of the repeating rifles, though, a technology that had been a singular means of advantage for the U.S. cavalry over the Plains tribes, have been provided by the United States government's Bureau of Indian Affairs, under the pretense that they would only be used for hunting. Despite the vehement assertions to the contrary from countless correspondence penned by Army officers in the field to their superiors in Washington, D.C., besieging them to stop this clearly conflicting practice, no such effort has been made by this summer of 1868. Now, as their horses are being killed by bullets funded by their own government, the men on the island's situation is rapidly becoming more and more dire. Forsyth and Beecher agree that the only course of action left is to kill the remaining horses and order the men to dig in more substantial breastworks behind the animals' bodies. As things are, the men are far too exposed, and their small force can now only hope to hunker down and hold their position. As the iron stink of blood and viscera permeate the air, the men dig in desperate, intermittent fits, stopping only to fire on assailing bands of attacking warriors who incessantly pester them with attacks. Some of the warriors take a more surreptitious route of attack, sneaking into the thick grass that lines the riverbanks and sniping at the men now effectively trapped on the island. As the fight drags on, the mighty Roman nose continues to watch from a distance. Initially, he had thought that his participation in the fight today may indeed prove unnecessary. With the enemy trapped and assumed to be at the mercy of antiquated weaponry, he had hoped this might be a chance for some of the younger warriors to make their own marks in their initial forays into combat. But as the afternoon sun burns brighter and hotter, and more young warriors fall to the Americans' repeating rifles, Roman Nose becomes more and more burdened by his own internal dialogue heaping guilt upon himself. Then, an old Cheyenne woman, observing this revered warrior not participating in the fight, begins to mercilessly chastise him. She browbeats him with accusations of laziness and, worse, cowardice, charging that the lives of young warriors lost today will be due to his reticence to act. Finally, Roman Nose can take no more. "I will die," he says, in a low, resigned tone, "but I will go." Despite the gravity of the situation, Roman Nose fastidiously paints his face and torso, checks his weapons, says his prayers, and finally dons his legendary war bonnet. The war bonnet itself speaks to the bizarre and desperate nature of the fate of these two groups brought together here today in combat in one of the most austere environments on the continent. The following is a description of the bonnet itself, made years later by the warrior who had constructed it, White Bull, as told by George P. Grinnell. Instead of having two buffalo horns attached at the headband, one on each side, it had but one rising over the center of the forehead. It had a very long tail that touched the ground, even when Roman Nose was mounted. This tail was made of a strip of young buffalo hide and had eagle feathers all along its length. First 4 red feathers, then 4 black ones, then 4 red feathers again, and so on. 40 feathers in all. For 8 years, Roman Nose has participated in fight after fight, in full confidence that the medicine from his headpiece will protect him from harm. Now, believing its powers compromised and that it will serve merely as an ornament in his own demise, he pulls the war bonnet down upon his head and rides out with a small group of fellow warriors to make an attack on the island. Again, as they had countless times before, he and his fellow warriors steel their nerves in the last seconds before urging their war horses forward at full speed towards the small island. The attack comes on, with the Americans at the island holding their fire until the mighty warriors are only 50 yards away before unleashing a volley of fire from their repeating rifles, followed in rapid succession by another and another. In the melee, Roman Nose is grievously wounded by a bullet to his torso. After a short fight, the force retreats over the hilltops and back to the village. Here, the mighty Roman Nose is pulled from his horse, his condition rapidly declining due to organ damage and loss of blood. He is taken inside of one of the lodges where medicine is applied to his wound, but his condition continues to rapidly deteriorate. By sunrise, the legendary Cheyenne warrior, who had fought so long for so hard without incurring so much as a scratch, lies cold in death inside one of the buffalo hide lodges of the village. Wails and lamentations resound, as the loss of such a great warrior and treasured friend is one felt as palpably here on the Great Plains as it is anywhere in the long and brutal course of history. Meanwhile, back on the island, Major General Forsyth now lies prostrate, grievously wounded himself by a bullet lodged in his thigh, dangerously close to his femoral artery. He props himself up on one elbow, giving directions and doing his best to address his own wounds. Suddenly, another charge comes on. Again, the succeeding minutes are filled with the din of gunfire and war cries, until again, the warriors retreat, and all on the island falls silent. Suddenly, to Major General Forsyth and the men's eternal shock and horror, First Lieutenant Beecher wearily stands up, seemingly in some kind of battle-induced stupor. He then falls to one knee, and begins to drag himself towards Forsyth. Beecher cries out, "I have my death wound, General. I am shot in the side, and dying." Forsyth desperately scrambles towards his friend. "No, Beecher, no," he manages to cry out, as the young first lieutenant falls. "Yes, good night," Beecher manages to stoically mumble, before his eyes close, and the soldier, who had survived the horrors of so many battles, utters his final words, "My poor mother." Forsyth and the men now find themselves in a state of shock and nearing despair as they lie prone, several of them injured, and now, with a total of 4 of their forces, including Beecher, Sergeant J.H. Moores, George W. Culver, and William Wilson, also lying dead on the small island in this shallow stream. Their proximity to death, in both time and space, has severely unnerved every man present, whether military or civilian. As the sun sets and a long, worrisome night unfolds, Forsyth considers his options. In the middle of the night, the men huddle behind the swelling and stinking carcasses of their horses and devise a plan. They cannot stay here, it is obvious to all. However, with all of their mounts now serving as defensive breastworks, their only means of escape will be on foot, in the middle of the high plains, with hundreds of warriors swarming the area. This is tantamount to suicide. Still, it is their only hope. Forsyth beseeches the men that someone will have to make the trek to Fort Wallace to request assistance. A 19-year-old named Simpson Jack Stillwell and a veteran French-Canadian trapper named Pierre Avalanche Trudeau, a man thought to be in his 60s but said to look much older, volunteered to make the 70-mile journey southeast, knowing that being caught will mean a certain, horrific death. The men depart before sunrise, walking backwards across the stream in hopes of deterring the native warriors who will eventually surely pursue them. They vanish into the night, and soon the sun rises on another day of hard fighting. Throughout the next 2 days, the intermittent charges from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors continue, now made even more frequently on foot, with the warriors sneaking as close to the island as possible before springing their attack. The fighting is a hard business, and as the hours drag on, it is believed that the 2 men sent to garner reinforcements have likely been caught and killed in their efforts. After 2 more nights, Major General Forsyth is now faced with 2 pressing dilemmas. One, the men he has sent out are now likely dead, and the only solution is to send another 2 men in hopes of completing a similar distance trek to a stagecoach stop due south of their present location. Here, they can wait for the next stagecoach to Fort Wallace. Scouts John J. Donovan and Allison J. Plilly volunteer for the task, and soon slip across the stream and over the horizon themselves, into the dead of night and dreadful uncertainty. The next problem to be addressed is the bullet lodged in Major General Forsyth's thigh. The projectile is pressing precariously against his femoral artery, and the wound is rapidly becoming vulnerable to infection. However, with the head surgeon having already been killed, Forsyth is unable to convince any of his men to try their hand at the rudimentary frontier surgery required to remove the bullet from his leg. This being the case, Forsyth does so himself, miraculously managing to safely remove the bullet and bandage his injured leg with only a knife as his instrument. Though he is successful in removing the bullet, the fever and ensuing infection leave many in Forsyth's command believing that he will soon join his friend Beecher in death. Meanwhile, by some other miracle, both rescue parties sent out, that of Stillwell and Trudeau, as well as that of Donovan and Plilly, made their way to Fort Wallace, arriving only hours apart. Reinforcements are marshaled, and on the 25th of September, a full 8 days after killing their horses and digging in behind their corpses, the surviving men left trapped on the island are greeted with the sight of eventual Medal of Honor recipient Lieutenant Colonel Lewis H. Carpenter and his 10th Cavalry Regiment of the famed Buffalo Soldiers, comprised of newly freed slaves who have volunteered to serve in the dangerous world of the U.S. Army's cavalry. Carpenter and the Buffalo Soldiers themselves are greeted with the sight of 50 dead and rotting horses, as well as 5 dead and rotting bodies of their fellow Americans, as well as the unyielding stench of a week's worth of death and decomposition in combination with a huge swarm of black flies. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, having seen the fight, at least on the whole, as merely another engagement, despite its tragic cost, have now grown tired of making charges on the doomed island and have, in the words of author Terry Mort in his work Cheyenne Summer, made their egress much in the fashion of an audience exiting a theater after a long performance. 5 full days later, on September 30th, the rescue force, as well as the men who had been trapped on the island, forever now known as Forsyth's Scouts, make their way back into the relative safety of the confines of Fort Wallace. Major General Forsyth will go on to survive his wounds, which included another gunshot wound to his torso and a grazing wound to his head, and he will go on to a long career in the U.S. Army. Ultimately, Walter Armstrong, one of the scouts wounded during the fight, will die of his wounds in hospital. He will be buried at Fort Wallace, while his fallen cohorts in Culver, Farley, Wilson, the surgeon Dr. Moores, and First Lieutenant Beecher would all be buried on the island where they fell. Though the course of the river has changed throughout the years, rendering the original site of his grave unknowable, the island itself is today known as Beecher's Island. The final resting place of Roman Nose is, as well, lost to the march of history. After the battle, his body was placed atop a funeral pyre and left to be consumed by the animals and elements, as was the tradition of the Cheyenne. Upon learning about the fight at Beecher's Island, another famous frontier figure, General George Armstrong Custer, remarked that it was the greatest battle on the plains. The consequences of the battles of Beecher's Island would have reverberations that would be felt throughout the next bloody decade of conflict on the plains between the United States Army and tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Blackfoot, and Comanche. But the stories of those battles, like the bloody tale of Custer's final fight at the Little Bighorn or the tragic massacre at Wounded Knee, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
May 1823, in the territory of what is now South Dakota, on the vast expanse of the undulating prairie that extended to the horizon in every direction, a contingent of mules, horses, and men moved warily next to a river, with pensive eyes switching from the water to the surrounding landscape, searching for signs of danger. They were hundreds of miles from anything resembling a city, in a territory that did not belong to them. They were a mix of men from a plethora of backgrounds, dressed in wool shirts, buckskin leggings, boots, moccasins, serapes, raccoon-skinned caps, flat-brimmed hats, and belts. Their common goal, put simply, was money. Money by way of accumulating and selling beaver pelts, the coveted material that made the popular top hats of the day worn throughout New York, Paris, and London. The means were simple. Set traps for the beavers, the animals would become ensnared in the traps and drown, they would collect the beaver pelts, and repeat this process until it became hard to find beaver. Then, they would move on. Simple. But simple does not always equal easy. Opposing them were the elements, from blazing heat to icy cold, from snow to dust storms, from droughts to flash flooding. Hostile native tribes like the Blackfoot, Arikara, and Comanche killed many in gruesome ways for violating their tribal territory bounds. Among this party of men
were some who would go on to become legends in the annals of mountain man history. They were commanded by General William H. Ashley and Major Andrew Henry, and among their ranks were Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith, two men whose future exploits would become the stuff of mountain man legend. Smith was an anomaly amongst an already anomalous lot, as he was a devout Methodist, read the Bible daily, refrained from coarse language, as well as dalliances with unknown women and strong drink. On this day, he was approached by Major Henry and directed to ride south to General Ashley's fort, known aptly as Fort Ashley. He was to inform General Ashley that the company was in need of more horses and that the Arikara tribe would likely be the closest to trade with in horseflesh. Jedediah Smith was still a relative neophyte in the world of fur trapping, but was a man on the rise within the ranks of his company as his reputation as a stalwart and trustworthy hand was growing. So Smith set out south, and was actually met by Ashley coming north at the Arikara village, where they sought to buy more horses. In terms of business, this appeared quite fortuitous for the trappers. The Arikara, a northern plains semi-agricultural tribe known for both their prowess in trade and warfare, whose ire had been stirred by some recent bad dealings with other white traders, were in a less than cordial mood. However, Ashley and his men had guns and ammunition that the Arikara knew they could acquire through few, if any, other sources. Thus, there was a terse and tense peace, as often happened in these instances. Tribes and trappers were not necessarily antagonistic, in fact, quite the opposite. Fur companies routinely employed native persons as translators, trackers, and trappers, as well as brokered many trading deals with tribes from New York to Oregon. Even in the early 19th century, in the middle of the plains, no culture existed in a vacuum. From the armchair of posterity, we are often inclined to view the cultural landscape at the time as a binary us versus them, or natives versus Americans paradigm. This was not only not true then, but it had not been the case for centuries. Tribes had warred and traded with each other for eons before the arrival of any European, and the introduction of the Spanish, French, English, Canadians, and Americans did not stop this, but only incorporated them into the complex and ever-evolving milieu of the New World. So, some initial dealings were made between the two parties, and it was mutually agreed upon that the trading would continue the next day. Ashley split his forces into one on land to guard the supplies, and two in the two boats which were anchored about 30 yards off the banks of the river. Ashley would be in direct command of the boats, and Jedediah Smith would be in charge of the force on land. Nearly all of the mountain men present went about their nightly routine of making dinner, cleaning their weapons, checking their supplies, and preparing for the next day's travel and trading. But when all had bedded down for the night, two men from the mountain men's party snuck into the Arikara camp with whiskey and trinkets that they hoped to trade for sexual favors from the Arikara women. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. But just as the braves made it to the shore and the sound of sloshing water from their swim strokes had abated, they were replaced by the frantic screams of the two mountain men who had snuck into the Arikara camp. These men had indeed found the Arikara women that they were hoping to, but they had also found Arikara men who were not too happy with the presence of intruders attempting to defile their wives, daughters, and sisters. One had been cut down in the camp, and another, Edward Rose, had escaped and now appeared on the banks of the river, making his way as fast as he could for Jedediah Smith's party. He screamed that his partner in mischief, a man named Aaron Stevens, was dead, and the Arikara were now in a collectively combative mood. Still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness and alerted to both the attempted robbery of Ashley's boat and the killing of their comrade in the camp by the now presumably enraged Arikara, the mountain men began to vociferously debate their options. Some argued for immediately moving the horses they had, a sizable herd by this point, to the opposite shore before daybreak, so that they might be in a better position to flee when the sun came up, with at least the river between them and the expected Arikara attack. Others argued for the retrieval of Stephen's body. As these debates carried on, a lone Arikara appeared on the horizon above the riverbanks. Still in the dark, he called out that he would try to broker a deal to get them Stephen's body back for the price of one of their best horses. The mountain men agreed to this, but a short time later, the enterprising Arikara returned to inform them that unfortunately, he would not be able to uphold his end of the deal. Stevens's body had been so badly mutilated, he said, that there was nothing substantive for him to bring back to them. This, understandably, sent a cold chill through the ranks of the party. It was decided that they would now have to move the horses as soon as possible, as the sunrise neared with every passing minute. Remaining calm and cool by all accounts, Jed Smith embraced his first real opportunity at leadership and calmly directed the movement of the horses to and then across the river. However, as the sun began to rise and a large number of horses and men were still mid-river or near the bank waiting for their turn to move, the mountain men were greeted with a horrifying sight. Silhouetted in the new morning sunlight were hundreds of Arikara warriors, tamping down shot into their muskets, knocking their arrows, and taking up offensive positions. The full gravity of the situation hit everyone present, seemingly instantly and seemingly simultaneously. They were stuck, with the enemy having the high ground and no cover to be found. At this point, fish in a barrel might not have been an adequate descriptor of the position of the men present in the shore party. Within moments, musket balls, spears, and arrows began to rain down on them from above. Dozens of horses and a few men fell dead in the initial volley, with many others gravely wounded. The screams of injured and dying horses and men filled the air, as Ashley and the men in the boats attempted to meet them on the other shore and make their getaway. The boats provided what covering fire they could, and the men on shore took cover behind the bodies of the dead horses. From here, as chaos reigned all around, Jed Smith coolly and calmly doled out directions to those in charge. As he and his men fired and reloaded, they made strategic retreats, making their way via leapfrogging one defensive position at a time to the comparative cover and safety of the boats. In all of this, Ashley's boat had run aground momentarily on a sandbar. The other boat, at around this time, cut the tie to their anchor and began moving downstream in an attempt to save at least themselves from this seemingly helpless situation. Ashley's boat was quickly freed and made its way as close to the shore as possible. Jed Smith and his men finally reached the banks of the river. They dove in and began to frantically swim. Some were hit by arrows and some by musket balls, and they sank under the surface, never to be seen again. Some were swept down the river, beyond the extended oars and hands of their comrades, also never to be seen again. The lucky few who managed to make it to the boats, including Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, hunkered down and returned fire as the boats made their way as fast as possible down the Missouri River and out of the Arikara musket and arrow range. For some of these men, this would be enough to end their mountain man adventures. Those who had decided that they had seen enough of this wild and dangerous life were put on a boat back to St. Louis along with their injured and recovering companions. No one could blame them, and no one did, for preferring the comforts of home to this lonely land where life was short and seemingly cheap. However, Colonel Ashley, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith were not done. Ashley would go on to mount retributive efforts with the U.S. Army, and Hugh Glass would go on to pen a heart-wrenching letter to the family of John Gardner, a mountain man who had been killed in the Arikara fight. The following is that letter. Dear Sir, my painful duty is to tell you of the death of your son who befell at the hands of the Indians 2nd June in the early morning. He lived little while after he was shot and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. We brought him to the ship where he soon died. Mr. Smith, a young man of our company, made a powerful prayer which moved all of us greatly, and I am persuaded that John died in peace. His body we buried with others near this camp and marked the grave with a log. His things we will send to you. The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after a great storm of rain and thunder, they came at us before light, and many were hurt. I myself was shot in the leg. Master Ashley is bound to stay in these parts till the traitors are rightly punished. Your obedient servant, Hugh Glass. This letter denotes not only Glass's deep sense of humanity, but it's the first mention of Jedediah Smith's piety and character from one of his contemporaries. Jedediah Smith would mount an expedition along with an unnamed French-Canadian trader to a nearby fort in hopes of mounting even larger retributive forces to supplement those that Ashley had already mustered. After this, he would carry on to travel perhaps more country than any other mountain man ever. The stories of the exploits of Ashley, Glass, and Jed Smith are too numerous to summarize in one episode, though rest assured we will be delving into their stories again soon. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
February 18th, 1847, Truckee Lake, California. After 2 weeks traveling east through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains in freezing temperatures, 7 men rode into a clearing near the eastern shore of the isolated mountain lake. They were a rescue party, sent out after a member of this group, a man by the name of William Eddy, had made a harrowing journey to the Sacramento Valley from this camp in order to contact the outside world and muster a rescue force. Now, as these men approached the camp, they began to call out for any survivors. At first, their cries were met with a deafening and chilling silence. A member of the rescue party, Daniel Rhodes, gave an account of what happened next. We crossed Truckee Lake on ice and came to the spot where we had been told we should find the immigrants. We looked all around, but no living thing except ourselves was in sight, and we thought that all must have perished. We raised a loud halloo, and then we saw a woman emerge from a hole in the snow. As we approached her, several others made their appearance in like manner, coming out of the snow. They were gaunt with famine, and I never can forget the horrible, ghastly sight they presented. The first woman spoke in a hollow voice, very much agitated, and said, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The people at this remote camp, many of them children, had endured unthinkable things. Many people today think they know the story of the Donner Party, a small group of unfortunate, foolhardy settlers who suffered the wages of their miscalculations by eating each other. It's seen as a story of misfortune, endurance, and ultimately survival. And while all those things might be true in part, in whole, what the tale of the Donner Party is a horror story. See, many also think the party were ultimately found and rescued by fearless mountain men. This, too, is true in part, but it's not the whole story. This initial group of 7 rescuers would be known to history as the First Relief, and they would be just the beginning of the last terrible chapter for those pitiable souls stuck at that lake in the middle of nowhere. But how did they get stuck there in the first place? The Donner Party was actually a collection of families, composed of men, women, children, and all their livestock and belongings, along with a number of single men that had hired on as help to drive the wagons and animals. The party was 87 people in total, more than half of which were children. They had originated as the Donner family, headed by husband George Donner and wife Tamsin Donner. With them were their 3 daughters, Frances, age 6, Georgia, age 4, Eliza, age 3, and George's daughters from a previous marriage, Elitha, 14, and Leanna, 12. George's younger brother, Jacob, 56, also joined the party with his wife, Elizabeth, 45, Isaac, age 6, Louis, age 4, and Samuel, age 1. Also traveling with the Donner brothers were Teamsters Hiram O. Miller, Samuel Shoemaker, Noah James, Charles Berger, John Denton, and Augustus Spitzer. They were joined by the Reed family, Margaret, age 32, stepdaughter Virginia, age 13, daughter Martha Jane, age 8, sons James and Thomas, age 5 and 3, and Sarah Keyes, Margaret Reed's mother. The Reed family was led by James Reed, who will prove to be a seminal figure in this story. Reed was a relatively well-off furniture maker from Illinois with a fiery temper but a penchant for leadership. Unfortunately, Reed did not have a penchant for transcontinental navigation. He had read a book by a man named Lansford Hastings that advised those en route to California via the now famous Oregon Trail route to take a cutoff through the deserts of Utah and Nevada. There were 3 major problems with this idea, though. 1, Hastings had never actually taken the route himself. He had just studied a few maps and deduced it to be a more expedient route than the one many tribes and mountain men had trodden in some form or fashion for centuries. He was so confident in his route, Hastings published a book advising people to take it. 2, the area they went through was completely desolate, unforgiving desert, and they were woefully under-equipped and inept in the environment. And 3, it, in fact, would later be found to be about 140 miles longer than the original route. So it wasn't a shortcut at all. But, against the advice of their mountain man guide and the rest of their wagon train, the Reeds, Donners, and a number of others that they had convinced to go with them, including Lavanna Murphy, a widow from Tennessee, who headed a family of 13, Harriet Murphy Pike and her husband William M. Pike joined the party, and their daughters Naomi and Catherine also joined. Most of these kids are between the ages of 1 and 5 years old. The aforementioned William H. Eddy, a carriage maker from Illinois, had brought his wife Eleanor and their 2 children James and Margaret. The Breen family consisted of Patrick Breen, a farmer hailing from Iowa, his wife Margaret, and their 7 children. And finally, there was the Kesebergs, Louis and his wife Elizabeth Philippine, and their son Louis Jr. Nearly immediately, the divergent group faced innumerable and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Water was nowhere to be found, rations were sparse, and the landscape was not conducive at all to travel by wagon. The livestock often wandered off in search of food and water, and the routes initially proposed in either Hastings' book or by Reed himself were often impassable and had to be retraced. Numerous party members died along this trail, but the vast majority survived. However, compounding their leadership problems and splintering factions even further, by the time they reached the Sierra Nevadas, James Reed had been banished from the party. Reed had stabbed another man, John Schneider, in either the throat, chest, or stomach, according to different eyewitness accounts, during an altercation, bleeding the man out within seconds into the parched desert sands. In this land far removed from constitutional jurisdiction, the rest of the party were unsure what to do with Reed. Some suggested hanging him, but instead, they settled for banishing him from the party to make his way alone to California. Though this was in many ways a tacit death sentence, Reed would make his way over the Sierras and ultimately prove a saving grace to his family and estranged travel companions, though one could certainly be forgiven for pointing out that this whole situation may well be blamed on Reed and his ego in the first place. Now essentially leaderless, the party continued their ascent into the Sierras. The entire group held a palpable air of anxiety, knowing that they had been long delayed. That anxiety soon rose to terror, as one morning the party awoke to a truly terrifying sight: snow on the Sierra mountaintops. It had come early this year and rendered the Donner Party narrowly but fatally outside the window of opportunity to cross the nearly impassable Sierras with even a modicum of assurance that they would emerge alive on the other side. Still, there was little else to do but make a desperate push to get through, hopefully before conditions got even worse. But things got worse. Worse in a way that no one on record had ever experienced before. The native tribes of the area knew better than to undertake such a fatal errand, but even they did not fully know just how bad the high Sierras were in the winter, at least not for any extended period of time. There was just no reason for anyone to ever be up there, they figured. And they were right. Soon, the party would be snowed in at Truckee Lake. they would construct small cabins with each family forming small mini-camps within a few miles of each other. They would ration their food, dress their children as warmly as they could, and do their best to keep fires burning by continually venturing out to collect wood. That winter would be unusually harsh, not so much for its duration, but for its intensity. Snowstorm after snowstorm pounded the area, with more than 20 feet of snowfall being estimated to have fallen. If you go to the campsite today, you can see old trees seemingly inexplicably cut off 20 feet in the air. These were where the Donner Party had cut them down. As with so much snow, only 2 to 3 feet of the enormous trunk would have remained visible to them. Ship's logs from San Francisco and Morro Bays note snow on the mountaintops that surrounded their coastal enclaves. The vast majority of those who died were men aged 18 to 39, followed by women in the same age group, as they died desperately searching for ways to keep their children alive. When they ran out of meat, they boiled bones. When they ran out of bones, they cut strips of ox hide and boiled those until a flavorless goo could be extracted. The children would be lined up and a spoonful placed in each of their mouths as they did their best not to reflexively gag up the only nourishment they had. They planned to hunker down here and wait out the worst of the Sierra winter. But whether they perished in the cold that year or made it out alive to the Sacramento Valley only to be haunted for the remainder of their days, for every single person at Truckee Lake, the winter of 1846 would not end in their lifetime. Because soon, there would be no more oxhide left to boil, no more food left to eat. And soon, people would begin to succumb to these ironically hellish conditions. Then, starving people would be confronted with two choices: do the unthinkable or die. It would ultimately take 2 months and 4 total rescue parties to retrieve anyone who had managed to survive that winter. Each trip required the party, whose motives also included rescuing the valuable goods left by the Donner Party's deceased, to scale thousands of feet in elevation at great peril to themselves. And each time a party arrived to bring more people out and more snow thawed, more and more of what had happened that terrible winter became apparent. By the time the 4th Rescue Party, or 4th Relief, arrived in April of 1847, the macabre scene that greeted them rivaled anything modern horror cinema has ever even come close to. Wandering their way through the camp searching for any valuables or survivors, they were first greeted with the horrible stench of flesh that had begun to putrefy in the warming weather. They came across the body of a young woman, slashed open and denuded of fatty tissue at the breast, with arms missing large strips of flesh that had been deliberately filleted off. Her skull had been cracked open at the top, and all the brain tissue had been scooped out. 2 more heads were found in similar condition. Then another body, this one of Mrs. Donner, lying similarly butchered but identifiable. Then they came across the cabin of Louis Keseberg. The following is an eyewitness account given by one Captain Fallon, who was the first to lay eyes on Keseberg that day. Upon entering, discovered Keseberg lying down amidst the human bones, and beside him a large pan full of fresh liver and lights. They asked him what had become of his companions, whether they were alive, and what had become of Mrs. Donner. He answered them by stating that they were all dead. Mrs. Donner, he said, had, in attempting to cross from one cabin to another, missed the trail and slept out one night. That she came to his camp the next night very much fatigued. He made her a cup of coffee, placed her in bed, and rolled her well in the blankets, but the next morning found her dead. They asked Keseberg if the contents of the frying pan in his cabin were indeed the liver and brains of Mrs. Donner. Keseberg replied enthusiastically that they were. When his interrogators asked why he did not eat the bit of beef that the 3rd rescue party had left him, actually James Reed had left it for him, he came back, bathed Keseberg, combed his hair, and gave him some food to hold him over until this last 4th Relief could come and rescue him. Keseberg replied
that it was not nearly as sweet as human meat, and the liver was the tastiest bit of human of all, not to be skipped in favor of boring, old, too dry beef. Keseberg was ultimately rescued and returned to society to live an ostracized existence, though the rest of the survivors were not harshly shamed, as they were seen to have taken no glee in what they were forced to do. Another cleanup party of sorts would come in the months later after the fourth relief. They would dig a huge pit in the middle of one of the cabins, put all of the earthly pieces of the unfortunate souls who had perished here on this lonely shore into it, and burn it all to ashes. They hoped, with the last of the smoke and embers, to extinguish as best they could the horrific memories of what had happened in this place. But they would not. Today, in the campsite where so much horror occurred, there is a museum and a monument to what occurred there in the winter of 1846. And, of course, Truckee Lake, upon whose shores the desperate party had sought refuge and endured something as close to hell as almost any human beings in history, is no longer Truckee Lake. Today, it's known as Donner Lake. Now, what we've covered tonight is but a small slice of the entire story of the Donner Party. There's the stories of James Reed and his multiple desperate attempts to save his family. There's the equally harrowing and horrifying tale of the Forlorn Hope, the group who set out from the Donner camp in search of rescue. There's the stories of the lives the survivors lived and the traumas they dealt with or at times succumbed to. All are tales worthy of their own episodes. But for tonight, those are stories for another time. Fall, 1841, Enchanted Rock, Central Texas. On a crisp fall afternoon, a small group of land surveyors, under the employ of the Republic of Texas, made their way through the territory near what is today Fredericksburg, Texas. They have been sent out here, some 95 miles west of Austin, to survey and legally demarcate land grants and territorial claims. Though this job came with a seemingly banal description, this was perhaps, at the time, the most dangerous line of work in the world. Not because the act of land surveillance was particularly hazardous, but because, in 1841, this was very possibly the most dangerous place on Earth. And it was so very dangerous because it was the territory of perhaps the most feared tribe on the continent. They called themselves the Namuro, which simply meant the people, a self-referential catch-all term that is not uncommon in tribal names. Tribes like the Apache, the Waco, the Tawankoni, the Tonkawa, and countless other small Texas tribes whom they had been warring with for decades knew them by another name. They knew them as the Comanche. This is thought to be a derivation of a Ute phrase meaning those who fight us all the time. The name may have come from one of their longtime enemies, but it was apt. The Comanche had migrated down to the plains of Texas and Oklahoma after being unable to sustain their livelihoods as hunter-gatherers in the northern Rocky Mountains. They had been an offshoot of the Shoshone tribe, who for centuries had barely subsisted in the unforgiving environs of the Rockies' granite ranges and aspen forests, until they were finally forced out by stronger tribes. They suffered greatly as the perpetually downtrodden, and had only begun their ascent to martial prowess when they encountered the animal brought over by the Spanish in the 16th century, the horse. The Spanish had closely guarded the secrets of horsemanship and caretaking of the animals, knowing all too well the potential for disaster should their adversaries turned subjects ever be able to combat them from horseback en masse. But despite their precautionary efforts, after the decades of raiding from the surrounding tribes, the absconding of natives who had been trained in horsemanship and care in order to serve their Spanish overlords, and the inevitable cultural mixing that comes from proximity, a sizable number of their mounts, as well as a sizable amount of their institutional equine knowledge, had spread to the southern plains. Though the Apache had been the first to introduce the horse in any meaningful capacity to the Texas frontier, it would be the Comanche who,
for reasons that have been often described as too ethereal to quantify, possessed an innate and undeniably palpable connection to the horse. Within a few decades of their exposure to the horse, they had not only mastered riding skills to rival most any horseman on the planet, but had completely transformed their way of life. Once, their days had been spent scouring the spare countryside in search of roots, berries, and scavengeable carcasses for salvageable protein. Now, they were a society of highly mobile and masterful hunters who existed almost entirely on the flesh of the buffalo that their new steeds enabled them to kill so readily. Where once they had been bereft of material wealth, they were now quite possibly the wealthiest tribe on the whole of the American continent in terms of horseflesh. And where once they had been the proverbial whipping boy of their neighbors, they had transformed into a fighting and raiding force whose mere mention would insert a pregnant, fearful pause in conversations from Denver saloons to the Capitol building in Mexico City. They had driven the Apache out of Texas, forestalled Spanish, French, English, Mexican, and American expansion for centuries, and wiped smaller tribes who had opposed them out entirely. Though the frontier had always been a brutal place, both pre- and post-European contact, the Comanche had been waging warfare of an intensity and scale that had rarely, if ever, been seen before. Comanche raiding entailed not only the taking of coup, nor, at least not initially, the adornment of its warriors in highly ceremonial dress. They had no formal stratification to their martial society, as nominal war chiefs were simply those who were able to marshal the most men for the raids that they proposed. Comanche warfare was simply a brutally violent, ruthlessly pragmatic affair. Until the latter half of the 19th century, many Comanche warriors eschewed large feathered headdresses in favor of animal headcaps made from foxes, cranes, or buffalo. They were often simply painted pitch black, which they believed to be the color of death. Raids were often conducted during full moons, so much so that a full moon was known throughout the Texas frontier as a Comanche moon, and was a much dreaded sight. And this was for good reason, as, on many a full moon night, isolated families of both settlers and natives had seen their whole worlds destroyed in a matter of minutes, gone in a torrent of blood, smoke, and flames. The new Republic of Texas, ironically, in many ways owed its existence to the ever-present threat of Comanche raiding. The Mexican government, their governing predecessors, had hoped to install a buffer of Anglo-immigrant settlers who would bear the brunt of the Comanche onslaught before it could reach further south into Mexico. For decades, prospective settlers from America had flooded into Texas from the east on condition that they convert to Catholicism and become Mexican citizens. Many had come, and many had died brutally hard deaths in their search for better lives. But, despite the cost, settlement attempts from Mexicans and Texans alike, from the Rio Grande Valley to present-day Fort Worth, persisted. And thus, so did Comanche raiding. However, despite the incessant threat of violence, the Texas government was faced with the routine administrative tasks that befall all bureaucracies, including marking out plots of its newly won, at least through their eyes, homeland. And so, surveying parties of 15 to 20 men scattered out across the Texas Hill Country northwest of San Antonio and Austin. They would keep descriptive logs of the land they covered, survey prospective plots, and, hopefully, return to the capital in Austin to provide a clearer picture of Texas's newly won territories. However, any interlopers into the territory west of the major Texas settlements were likely always under the watchful eye of the true rulers of the land, the Comanche. The Comanche had observed the surveying parties from the start, knew that they were the means by which the white men in Austin were laying claim to their lands, and, accordingly, hated them with an unfettered passion. Surveying parties were targeted with especially harsh, unremittent attacks. The Comanche preference was to take them alive and reserve their most sadistic tortures for them. Yet still, they came. Young men from the backwoods of Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Alabama flooded into the state after the Texas Revolution. Many had just missed the bloodshed of the battles of Goliad, the Alamo, and San Jacinto, and were now thirsting for a fight. For many, the dangers of being part of a surveyor team presented an enticing employment option. Such was the case for this party of young Texians, here in the shadow of the limestone monolith that is Enchanted Rock. For time immemorial, Enchanted Rock had been considered sacred by the tribes in the area. It was said to be the home of discontented spirits, from slain warriors to shamed chiefs. It was said that the native tribes practiced sacrifices at its base, and it was well known that any incursion into the territory surrounding Enchanted Rock would be met with the utmost of hostilities. However, the ever-present threat of violent, painful ends were not enough to dissuade this group of combat-hungry 20-somethings who had come to Texas for the express purpose of tempting such a fate. For all their bluster and bravado, though, these newly minted Texans were no fools. This party of 15 to 20 surveyors were among the most well-armed men on the planet at the time. Many of them carried the .36 caliber Colt Patterson revolver. Considered by many firearm collectors to be a seminal pistol in Old West history, it had been patented by Samuel Colt in 1836 and produced in Paterson, New Jersey, hence the name Colt Patterson. It had been originally calibered in a .28 caliber pistol, but had been changed to a .36 caliber in 1837. It held 5 shots as opposed to today's usual 6, and was loaded by detaching the cylinder, manually loading the cartridges, and then reassembling to fire. This meant that a combatant would have to preload several 5-shot cylinders and would be relegated to relatively cumbersome reloading processes in comparison to later models. The weapon weighed in at 2 pounds 12 ounces with a 9-inch barrel. This made it a very large, very loud, and, understandably, terrifying weapon to enemy combatants. With an effective range of roughly 65 yards, it was well suited to the horseback, high-speed, up-close fighting that was the new norm on the Texas frontier. For longer-range endeavors, many of the Texans were armed with the .42 caliber Edwin Wesson percussion cap rifles. In short, these are single-shot rifles that use small copper caps filled with mercuric fulminate as the ignition source to fire their projectiles. The small copper cap is placed on a plug under the hammer of the rifle, and when the hammer is released, the percussion ignites the mercuric fulminate, causing it to fire. These rifles were highly effective at ranges up to 150 yards and could be fired at a slightly faster rate than their flintlock predecessors at up to 3 to 4 rounds per minute. These advancements in weaponry had come at a fortuitous time for the Texans, particularly for those in the land surveillance parties and for the organization from which Stephen F. Austin so often chose to draw his land surveillance parties, the still young, but already legendary, Texas Rangers. It had been Stephen F. Austin himself, the legendary Texas statesman, whom the state capital is named after, who had fostered the original concept for the predecessors of the Rangers in the 1830s, the Texas Mounted Rifles. Born largely of necessity, the mounted rifles patrolled the ranges of the Texas frontier, presented the only available organized resistance against the Mexican governmental harassment, banditry, and Comanche raiding. In 1835, the organization had been codified into a state-sponsored military/law enforcement hybrid force uniquely capable of close-quarter combat and long-distance pursuit. In the intervening years, their legend had grown from the dusty settlements of Texas to the finest parlors of New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia. The Rangers presented virtually the only consequential resistance to the violence that plagued the flatland prairies, river valley bottoms, and hill country homesteads. The tales of their daring and ferocity spread like wildfire amongst not only Texans, Mexicans, and Americans, but amongst the Comanche as well. And perhaps none among the Rangers, and their ranks full of giant, strapping, bellicose young men, garnered more respect or more fear than did Captain John Coffee Hayes. He had been born in Little Cedar Lick, Tennessee, in 1817 to a military family. His father, Herman A. Hayes, had fought in the War of 1812 under Andrew Jackson. Herman named his son after Jackson's legendary Brigadier General John Coffee. John Coffee Hayes, known by those close to him as Jack, had made his way to Texas in 1836 at the age of 19 in search of fortune, adventure, and war. Though he had missed his chance to participate in the Texas Revolution, he had found a home with the Texas Rangers. The Rangers had a casualty rate that at times reached 50%, and it was assumed that a fair number of their fresh-faced recruits who proudly rode out of San Antonio and Austin would never be seen again. Even in the austere, hyper-violent world of the Rangers, though, Jack Hayes stood out. In an occupation replete with large, burly men, he was a slender 5'6", 20-something, with a boyish face and a quiet, affable demeanor. But one look at his eyes, even from today's vantage point, more than a century and a half removed, and it is apparent that the man was no slave to fear. His affable demeanor and unremarkable stature were, in countless eyewitness accounts, transformed into the striking and irrefutable figure of the unshakable, irascible Uber Ranger. The one who feared no hardship, thrived in the chaos of combat, and possessed an innate and undeniable ability to lead men who had proven otherwise ungovernable by the vast majority of society. His legend had spread far and wide through Texas, even in the short time he had been there in 1841, and this made him an ideal member for the surveying party Stephen F. Austin needed to send out to Enchanted Rock. And so it was that Jack Hayes, legendary ranger, found himself here at Enchanted Rock on this fall afternoon. As the survey team set about their laborious tasks of unspooling a few hundred yards of steel ribbon and then demarcating its location on a map, Hayes and a number of other ranger companions stood watch. At some point during their endeavors, though, Hayes decided to ride out toward Enchanted Rock to procure a better up-close view of the legendary landmark. Thinking himself secure as no Comanche had been spotted in the area, Hayes rode off alone. However, in an example of just how cunning and tactically brilliant the Comanche truly were, even the experienced ranger and his cohorts had failed to notice a sizable number of warriors trailing them. Hayes' departure from the main party was just the opportunity the force of Comanche had been waiting for as they lay watching in the overlooking limestone cliffs and oak-strewn hills. As Hayes neared the base of the rock, even his conditioned nervous system must have received a notable shock when the sound of Comanche war whoops cracked the still of the afternoon air. His brain, also highly conditioned to the rigors of fast-paced frontier combat, also likely surmised, almost instantaneously, that he had no hope of retreating to his party of fellow Texans before being caught and overrun by the Comanche. Now, quite literally caught between a rock and a hard place, Hayes rode hard to the base of Enchanted Rock, dismounted, and began a desperate, dogged scramble up the face. His intent was to gain himself a position on the highest ground in the area, and, in the words of author J.W. Wilbarger in Indian Depredations in Texas, see link in description, Hayes was determined to sell his life at the highest market price. Hayes' reputation, combined with his notable dark hair and moderate stature, made him a prize target among the ranks of the Comanche, and he was pursued up the side of the giant rock with the utmost gusto by several warriors intent on harvesting his scalp. However, Hayes had managed to ensconce himself in a crevice in the limestone and construct a haphazard defensive position. Here, he hunkered down with his .42 caliber rifle, aimed outward toward his pursuers, and 2 Colt Patterson revolvers in a holster on either hip. A less experienced frontier fighter might have made a fatal tactical miscalculation at this juncture, as the Comanche pressed their initial attack upon Hayes' position. As reliable and powerful as the Wesson percussion rifle may have been, it was still a single-shot weapon. This meant that any defender in Hayes' position would have essentially one shot on his pursuers, one that they must make count. After that, they would be forced to complete a loading process that would enable their enemy to close the gap between their positions and capture or kill them. Hayes had seen many a young ranger comrade fall victim to poor decision-making in this instance, only to miss their single shot and be cruelly ended by the Comanche. Hence, even as his pursuers rained down arrows upon his claustrophobic position, Hayes forced himself to hold his fire. Anytime a warrior would attempt to make a terminal charge on his position, Hayes would brandish the rifle barrel at him, managing each time to dissuade his attackers. Hayes knew that, for all their tactical prowess and combative ferocity, the Comanche approach to warfare did not now nor ever entail the enduring of casualties en masse in order to obtain a victory of any kind. In the mind of the Plains warrior, it was always better, if possible, to fight to another day. Such prudence, though no doubt understandable, left an exploitable gap for those caught in the ire of their attack. Even though alone and with a single-shot weapon, survival for the experienced ranger was not wholly impossible, and so Hayes hunkered down and fought on. The Comanche, though, soon tired of this hated intruder keeping them at bay from atop their own sacred landmark, and so, again in the words of J.W. Wilbarger, they resolved to make their attack in earnest. Hayes steadied himself behind the makeshift rock wall he had hastily constructed and waited what must have been an agonizing few minutes as the Comanche surrounded the base of the rock and began a charge en masse toward his position. Hayes waited unmoved, still hunkered down, until the leading warrior was within a few yards of his position. At the last second, Hayes rose up, brought the warrior into the sights of his rifle, and squeezed the trigger, sending a lead ball into the Comanche's torso. This caused the Comanche to momentarily stop to assess the damage to their fallen comrade and to shield themselves from any more gunfire that may be coming. When it was discovered the lead warrior was dead, the cry was put out, in long wolf-like howls, to move back to the base of the rock. This the Comanche did, as Hayes used the brief respite to reload and refit his rifle. He also rechecked the pair of Colt Patterson revolvers he had holstered on either hip, ensuring himself at least 10 additional shots once his initial, and this time likely final, rifle shot had been fired. In short order, the Comanche contingent made another, even more vociferous attack upon Hayes' position. The Comanche war cries flooded the air with high-pitched, blood-curdling screeches that would have shaken almost any Texan to their core. But not Jack Hayes. Hayes again coolly received the charge until the Comanches were within range, once again popping up from his position to the last second. Only this time, sensing this to be his proverbial last hurrah, Hayes pulled his revolvers and emptied the entirety of one's 5-shot cylinder into the Comanche surrounding him. This, again, begat another Comanche retreat. As Hayes again hunkered down and began hurriedly reloading for what he assumed was an inevitable third Comanche assault, he heard what must have been the very welcome sound of his comrades firing their weapons and making their way towards Enchanted Rock. They had been fighting an even larger body of Comanche during Hayes' tete-a-tete with the Comanche, and had only discovered his position when they heard the shots of his rifle and revolvers coming from high up on Enchanted Rock. Seeing this much larger force of Texans advancing, the Comanche force surrounding Enchanted Rock took their wounded and withdrew into the canyons and sagebrush of the hill country, leaving their dead for the vultures and Texans. Hayes and his cohorts reunited at the base of the rock and, under an undoubtedly more vigilant watch, continued their work until the next day. Hayes would go on to carry out countless more adventures, from leading the Rangers in the Mexican-American War to chasing down Comanche raiders. His legend among the Comanche would grow to such an extent that they bestowed upon him the begrudgingly respectful nicknames of Captain Jack, pronounced Captain Yak, and Bravo Too Much or Brave Too Much. In a culture like the Comanche, where courage and martial prowess were the ultimate in masculine virtues, even an avowed enemy like Jack Hayes was due his wages in reverence. Hayes would go on to marry Susan Calvert, daughter of a wealthy local hotel owner in Seguin, Texas, in 1847. In 1849, the young couple moved to California, along with millions of other Americans, in hopes of capitalizing on the new state's gold rush. Though he did not strike it rich in gold, Hayes would go on to become a successful rancher and businessman, and was elected sheriff of San Francisco in 1850. In 1853, not long after Hayes's first son, John Caperton Hayes, had been born in California, a peculiar package arrived in the mail for the new father. Inside the parcel was a small golden spoon, sent as a gift by the legendary Comanche chief, Buffalo Hump. The spoon came with a small engraving on the handle that read, Buffalo Hump Jr. Such was the level of respect Hayes had earned even amongst his longtime enemy. Hayes would pass away in 1883 at the age of 66 and is buried at the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. Tonight's story was but one snippet of Hayes's life, one that is replete with accounts of Comanche battles, suicidal attacks during the Mexican-American War, and countless other legendary escapades. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Northern Texas, September 12, 1874. As a cyclone of more than 100 Kiowa and Comanche warriors encircles them, unleashing a hail of bullets and arrows, a small group of U.S. Army scouts and soldiers are caught in the open prairie, fighting for their lives. All of them have incurred varying degrees of battle wounds thus far, with some in critical condition. They are a 6-man detachment of 4 enlisted men, Sergeant Woodhull and Privates Rath, Harrington, and Smith, as well as 2 Army scouts, Amos Chapman and Billy Dixon. Dixon is already a legend on the frontier, having made a name for himself only months earlier at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, where his ability to shoot down a Comanche chief from nearly a half a mile away had turned the tide of the battle and likely saved the lives of all of his comrades. Now, it seems that Dixon and his cohorts will find no such luck on this day, as the open prairie offers them nothing in the way of cover or concealment. This detail of men has been dispatched by Colonel Nelson A. Miles to carry dispatches concerning the delay of supplies being brought to his camp by Captain Willis Lyman's supply train. This delay had itself been the result of Kiowa and Comanche warriors stalling its progress with incessant raiding and attacks. Now, a smaller contingent of Kiowa and Comanche have diverted their forces to concentrate on the errant scouting detail. These attacks are not random occurrences. They are part of the ongoing Red River War, which will ultimately be the beginning of the end of the decades-long conflict between the tribes of the Southern Plains and the United States government. The Kiowa and Comanche have long been the dominant tribes here in the north of Texas, and are intent on fighting to the bitter end for their lands. The violence that has unfolded in the preceding decade and a half has been among the worst the already bloody history of Texas has ever seen. Countless innocents on both sides have perished. Countless combatants have lost their lives in brutal, bloody engagements, and untold amounts of lands and goods have been lost. It is well known amongst all soldiers and scouts that being caught in the open by the Kiowa and Comanche would be among the worst of all possible scenarios on the Texas plains. These warriors, though having relatively little in the way of formal hierarchy and militaristic structure, are perhaps the best light cavalry on the planet at this time. They are capable of feats of horsemanship largely only seen in present-day trick-riding exhibitions, all while being able to fire several arrows a minute. Their tactics, well known but incredibly difficult to combat, are to bear down upon their adversaries in whirling cyclonic attacks, before eventually dispersing in scattered groups across the plains at the conclusion of the fight. For a United States Army whose last major conflict was the American Civil War, the difference between the more stratified, organized warfare of that conflict and defending and attacking against these highly mobile groups of guerrilla fighters is a stark, startling contrast. Billy Dixon is one of the most experienced scouts in the Army in this style of warfare, but even to him, this present fight seems to be in sheer futility, as he and his cohorts are easy targets for their adversaries. As soon as the attack commenced, every one of the men had known it would be only a matter of time until one of them was struck down by the Kiowa and Comanche fire. The first unfortunate soldier to fall would be Private George Smith, the man put in charge of holding the horses so as to keep them from stampeding away during the fight. Private Smith is hit only minutes into the fight with a bullet passing through one of his lungs, sending the man crumbling to the ground and setting the horses loose. The horses are still fully loaded with the men's haversacks, coats, blankets, and water canteens. In only a few moments, the soldiers have lost not only one of their own, but their supplies and transportation as well. The only option now would be to fight to the last man. The Kiowa and Comanche, however, seeing their enemies to now be easy targets, are in no rush to risk losing any of their own men with needlessly risky attacks. Therefore, they now engage in intermittent small attacks, with each warrior in these smaller groups seeking to win glory for their deeds of bravery and gallantry, measured by how close they are able to attack and how much damage they are able to inflict. The majority of their ire is directed away from the group of 5 soldiers and concentrated on the seemingly lifeless body of George Smith. The unfortunate Smith had been first assumed to be dead by his comrades, and they made great efforts to stop the attacking warriors from capturing his body. But Smith is, in fact, still alive and in great agony, but unable to do anything to assist himself. As the waves of attack press nearer and nearer to him, he can only lie prostrate and motionless as his friends attempt to defend him. Finally, though, the fight becomes too intense for any of the remaining men to hold their current exposed positions. Dixon spots a small mesquite flat over a quarter-mile away and suggests that the men make a run for its relative cover. But just before they can make their move, Dixon's fellow Army scout, Amos Chapman, is struck by a bullet. He matter-of-factly alerts his comrade, "Billy, I am hit at last." Though Dixon is looking at Chapman when he is shot, he is not able to ascertain the severity of the wound to his comrade while keeping up the fight himself. However, during his next lookout onto the prairie to fire upon the charging warriors, Dixon spots a closer option for cover, a shallow depression in the plains not far from their current position. The depression, known as a buffalo wallow, is the result of the buffalo herds who still frequent the area, pawing and wallowing in the prairie dirt. Though it is not ideal, it would certainly be an improvement from their current circumstances. So, Dixon shouts to his comrades that he will make a break for the buffalo wallow in an attempt to see close up whether or not it will provide a suitable place for them to make a defensive stand. He then makes a mad dash amongst withering Kiowa and Comanche fire to the wallow, which measures roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. Dixon determines that the shallow depression will provide enough cover and yells for the remainder of his able-bodied comrades to follow his lead. This they do, and within minutes the men are busy digging with their hands and bowie knives, piling up the soft sand to the edges of the wallow in between defending against the charges of the native warriors. The Kiowa and Comanche now, for their part, intensify their attacks on the buffalo wallow, seeing a more immediate need to finish off their quarry. As the day drags into the afternoon, the psyches of some of the men caught in this desperate plight in the middle of the buffalo wallow begin to fray. The following is Billy Dixon's first-hand account of one of his comrades reaching their perceived psychological limits during the vicious engagement. Many times that terrible day did I think that my last moment was at hand. Once, when the Indians were crowding us awfully hard, one of the boys raised up and yelled, "No use, boys, no use. We might as well give it up." We answered by shouting him to lie down. At that moment, a bullet struck the soft sand near him and completely filled his mouth with dirt. I was so amused that I laughed, though in a rather sickly way, for none of us felt much like laughing. In a lull in the fighting, one of the men shouts to Amos Chapman, still alive but badly wounded, telling him to make his way over to the buffalo wallow. Chapman shouts back that the bullet that struck him has broken his leg, and he is unable to walk. Dixon decides that he, as the most able-bodied man available, having suffered only a slight wound to his right calf, will make an attempt to save his friend and fellow scout. Returning to Dixon's account, I made several efforts to reach him before I succeeded. Every time the Indians saw me start, they would fire such a volley that I was forced to retreat, until I finally made a run and got to Chapman. I told him to climb on my back, my plan being to carry him as I would a little child. Drawing both his legs in front of me and laying the broken one over the sound one to support it, I carried him to the wallow, though not without difficulty, as he was a larger man than myself, and his body a dead weight. It taxed my strength to carry him. Now, all of the men, in their various states of injury and agony, begin to silently, deliberately, dig and scoop more of the silted earth up into the short wall around the edge of the wallow. Despite their composure, the dire nature of their situation only intensifies, as the attacks increase in frequency and ferocity before one of the chiefs is shot down. Dixon's account continues. When I look back and recall our situation, I always find myself thinking of how my wounded companions never complained or faltered, but fought as bravely as if a bullet had not touched them. Sometimes the Indians would ride towards us at headlong speed with lances lifted and poised, undoubtedly bent on spearing us. Such moments made a man brace himself and grip his gun. Fortunately, we were able to keep our heads and bring down or disable the leader. Such charges proved highly dangerous to the Indians, and gradually grew less frequent. For much of the afternoon, as the hot sun beats down upon them, the men on both sides fight on. The warriors continue their assaults on the buffalo wallow, while the ammunition of the scouts and soldiers begins to dwindle. The thoughts of every man within the buffalo wallow, at some point or another during the long afternoon, drift to the horrifying possibility of the worst possible outcome in this situation, being captured alive. Dixon recalls, "Ours was the courage of despair. We knew what would befall us if we should be captured alive. We had seen too many naked and mangled bodies of white men who had been spread-eagled and tortured with steel and fire to forget what our own fate would be, so we were determined to fight to the end." Then, just when it seems things cannot possibly become more desperate, the North Texas weather undertakes one of its notorious sudden changes, as storm clouds seem to fill the sky out of nowhere. At around 3 o'clock, a torrential downpour manages not only to soak the exposed men and their equipment, but to fill the bottom of the buffalo wallow with roughly 2 inches of muddy brown water, which mixes with the blood and gore of the wounded men, creating a nightmarish miasma. But the storm also serves to forestall the attacks of the Kiowa and Comanche. They now sit stoically upon their horses, wrapped snugly in blankets, just out of rifle range, waiting for the storm to pass. Meanwhile, the men in the buffalo wallow have only their thin linen shirts and military boots and pants to ward off the sudden cold. Any of the supplies they may have had are now gone with their horses, along with Dixon's coat, which contains his one and only picture of his mother given to him by his dying father. But despite the lull in attacks, and in spite of the relentless cold and wet of the storm, the solemn business of surviving the fight at hand still has to be dealt with. With ammunition running low, the men suggest that one of them retrieve the weapon and cartridge belt of the fallen Private George Smith. Private Peter Rath volunteers to undertake this dangerous endeavor. Rath dashes to Private Smith's location, only to discover, to his horror, that Smith is in fact alive and has been left prostrate, bleeding, and suffering for the entirety of the battle. Rath runs back to the buffalo wallow and informs Dixon and the others that Smith is still alive, but too injured to move. Dixon and Rath then make their way back to Smith, where upon further examination, Dixon finds the wound to be all but certainly fatal. Still, they manage to get Smith up and back to the buffalo wallow. Here, as the sky blackens and night falls, the Kiowa and Comanche disappear over the rolling hills of the plains. Smith suffers his final hours in great agony, often begging his comrades to end his suffering. At roughly 11 p.m., his body is found to have gone cold in death. Now, the men are left with the fatal proposition of either going to find help or staying to meet the native warriors the next day. First, Private Rath again volunteers to go out into the night in search of the trail that will lead them to the nearby Camp Supply. 2 hours later, he returns, disappointedly reporting that he has failed to find the trail. Now, it will be up to Dixon to wait until the first signs of daylight and venture out to find their lifeline to safety. His account of the events continues. Like everything else, the long night finally came to an end, and the sun rose clear and warm the next morning. By this time, all of the men were willing that I should go for help, and I at once started. Daylight exposed me to many dangers from which the night shielded me. By moving cautiously at night, it was possible to avoid the enemy, but if surprised, to stand a good chance of escape. In the daytime, however, the enemy could lie in hiding and scan the country in every direction. On the plains, especially in the fall when the grass is brown, the smallest moving object may be perceived by the trained eye at an astonishingly long distance. I knew that I must proceed with utmost caution, lest I fall into an ambush or be attacked in the open by superior numbers. I had traveled scarcely more than half a mile when I struck the plain trail leading to Camp Supply. Hurrying along as rapidly as possible and keeping a constant lookout for Indians, I checked myself into the sudden sight of an outfit that seemed to cover about an acre of ground 2 miles or so to the northwest. The outfit at first did not appear to be moving, and I could not tell whether it was made up of white men or natives. I skulked to a growth of tall grass and hid for a while. My nerves were too keen to endure hiding and waiting, so I stole back and took another look. The outfit was moving towards me. Shortly, I was able to see that they were troops. I have never felt happier in my life. I wanged loose with my old .50 to attract the attention of the soldiers and saw the whole command come to a halt. I fired my gun a second time, which brought 2 soldiers to me. I told them of our condition, and they rode rapidly back to their command and reported. Dixon now accompanies the soldiers back to the buffalo wallow, but the passing troops offer only some hardtack and water to the injured men, as their surgeons perform only cursory examinations of their wounds before the troop moves on, promising reinforcements will soon come. Meanwhile, the survivors of what history will come to know as the Buffalo Wallow fight bury the body of Private George Smith at the bottom of the wallow they had fought for their lives from. It will be 2 more days of waiting next to a nearby creek before the men would hear the welcome sound of the cavalry coming their way. They will go on to be taken back to Camp Supply and cared for. Amos Chapman's leg will be amputated above the knee, but, in Dixon's recollection, Amos was as tough as second-growth hickory, and was soon out of the hospital and in the saddle. All of the survivors would go on to continue their careers with the Army, as well as stay in touch via letters sent amongst each other for years to come. With a pang of notable regret, Dixon recounts in the last line of the chapter in his memoir concerning the events, "It was always my intention to go back and mark the spot where the Buffalo Wallow fight took place, and where George Smith still lies buried. Procrastination and the remoteness of the spot have prevented my going." Still, all of the survivors of the Buffalo Wallow fight, Sergeant Woodhull and Privates Rath and Harrington, as well as the scouts Amos Chapman and Billy Dixon, were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Private George Smith, who had perished in the midst of the battle, was as well posthumously awarded the medal, the nation's highest honor for military valor in combat. The medals were presented by Colonel Nelson A. Miles, himself a recipient of the award. For their part, the Kiowa and Comanche, as well as their counterparts in the Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho, will continue to combat the United States government in a desperate bid to maintain their homelands and way of life. Their conflict will carry on for another 9 months, finally ending in June of 1875, when Quanah Parker and his band of Quahati Comanche reported to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. The Red River War will go down in the annals of Old West history as one of the most consequential conflicts ever waged on the North American continent. But the many tales of the dangerous, bloody exploits of Billy Dixon and the Army Scouts, as well as the bravery and ruthlessness of the tribes of the Southern Plains during the Red River War, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.